The girl was chained to a chair. She was completely exhausted, her head bowed. Suction cups and sensors with wires were attached to her body. The girl turned to Woohyun and said in despair that she could no longer hold back. Woohyun continued to tell himself it was just a realistic game and hoped to escape it soon. Something inside him shifted when the girl looked up at him. He saw tears on her face and a trickle of blood coming from her mouth. The girl apologized to him and went limp for a moment. Woohyun loudly screamed denial and began cursing everything around him. A young man was chained to another chair. His clothes were bloody. He turned to Woohyun and with a slight smile on his face said that this was likely the end for him too. Another guy also chained to another chair tried to convince Woohyun that he had to survive at any cost. Woohyun couldn't believe what was happening and screamed in denial. Time passed, but he had no choice but to accept it. The young man looked around and begged the boys not to abandon him. He begged them to stay. He was one of those chained, but he felt better. He begged for a long time not to be left alone, but he knew no one was listening to his pleas anymore. Tears of despair began to stream from his eyes. His body trembled with fear. This place had become his new reality. This guy had no way to change anything or save the lives of the guys around him. This caused Woohyun a lot of pain. This game was called Reverse Planet, and it was the game that took first place in the entire world in the virtual reality genre. With concepts such as dimension gates, supernatural powers, and invasion wars, it has earned high praise from players. The guy entered this game on the recommendation of a friend and found himself locked in this world. He couldn't even imagine how that very conversation about the amazing game would turn out. In the world where the inverse planet manifested itself as a true reality, everything was completely different, and the young man acted as a test subject. The subject was congratulated on being one step closer to becoming a transcendent of the Transcendence Project. Transcendence was a crazy research project involving thousands of people with the goal of creating the only transcendent. The kidnapped victims were used as test animals and subjected to electric shocks, forced drug injections, and body modifications. In a word, all these experiments were completely inhumane. In the event of an unsuccessful experiment, the corpse was burned and the participants were moved from place to place, literally sorted. Woohyun held out longer than anyone else and knew that he could never forgive these people. The boy couldn't accept that this was his current reality, one that would never end. This only fueled his hatred. He understood perfectly well that he had to survive to achieve his revenge. At one point, a siren came on from the speaker warning that all the test subjects had escaped and that they should arm themselves and be ready to fight them. It was a great miracle that the prisoners managed to escape, and they all ran in a group towards the exit. There was very little left. The prisoners only had to walk one corridor and they would be free. Well, suddenly the whole group had to slow down because an obstacle appeared right in front of them. A man with red hair stood in front of them and laughed that the prisoners really believed that they would be able to escape, and was very surprised that they managed to run all the way to this place. The man smiled broadly and noted that the fact that the prisoners had managed to reach this exit was a good sign, since now it would be easier to kill them. The subjects quickly realized they were trapped. Everyone understood that this man seemingly out of nowhere posed a grave danger. One of the prisoners turned to Baek Woohyun and asked him to cover the rest from the rear while they tried to delay the enemy. The man shouted and called the prisoners fools and promised that he would kill them with just one blow. Woo Hung was the first to pounce on the man blocking the way and grabbed him tightly with his arms, giving the other prisoners the opportunity to run to the exit. The man screamed, but his cry was abruptly cut off by a hoarse groan. The man's body went limp. Woohyun instantly found himself on the floor next to the lifeless body of the enemy, but nearby, he also discovered the bodies of the prisoners who had not yet managed to escape. Woohyun couldn't hold back his tears. He was overcome with pain and despair. He couldn't believe it was happening again. He heard his name, and the voice sent a shock through his body like electricity. He heard the voices of his comrades asking him to avenge their deaths and speaking of their anger. The souls of the prisoners begged for revenge for them and pressed Woohyun, on whom they placed great hopes. After this incident with the run from the laboratory, time simply flew by and a whole year passed very quickly, and then 3 years. Woohyun remembered what happened and raided his enemies to avenge the people he loved. Woohyun heard gunshots very often afterward, and he was in grave danger, but that didn't stop him. Woohyun killed again and again, but his desire for revenge didn't wane. On the contrary, it only intensified. Woohyun was fortunate to have honed his excellent fighting skills, making revenge a relatively easy task. Woohyun was incredibly agile, fast, and intelligent. He killed his enemies in seconds before they even had time to react. The only problem was that he harbored a vengeance that seemed to have no end. Woohin couldn't truly stop. The souls of his fallen comrades were bound to him and did not let go for a minute, forcing him to kill more and more. Woohin wondered how long he had left to live like this and often wondered if he was seriously planning to continue in the same spirit until his death. One day, after another battle, a holographic active screen appeared in front of Woohin. Woohin was very surprised when he saw a task appear on the screen for him to eliminate the curator of the Transcendence Project with a reward of getting a chance to return to his home world. Woohin was very surprised at first, but soon he believed it and was happy because he thought he was stuck in that place forever. Corpses were scattered across the floor. All had been brutally murdered. Some were still showing signs of life as groans could be heard. The man in the suit knelt before the young man who had carried out the massacre and asked him why he had decided to do such a thing when he could have enjoyed the glory. The man in the suit was the curator of the Transcendence Project. He repeated his question over and over again, still hoping for an answer. The young man rushed up to him in a second and grabbed the curator by the collar of his clothes and laughingly wondered why he was even asking about such a thing. The young man Project Transcendence test subject number 81 named Kim Yeonjun was perplexed by his supervisor's question, unable to believe that he truly didn't know the reason. The curator shouted loudly and asked subject 81 to shut up, explained that he doesn't talk to people like him. I'm a young man, for some reason he let him go. The curator saw Baek Woo-hyun standing before him. This man's appearance evoked far more emotion and respect in the curator than his interaction with Kim Yeonjun. Baek Woo-hyun was Project Transcendence test subject number 62. The curator immediately began to talk about how Baek Woo-hyun is a true superhuman, surpassing all human boundaries with his body, and is the ultimate success of the Transcendence Project. The curator began to promise Baek Woo-hyun to fulfill everything he wanted and said that the young man was on a completely different level than the other test subjects, but immediately received a blow from him. Woo-hyun looked at the curator with disdain and replied that he was not interested, to which the curator called him a stupid animal who was very mistaken in thinking that killing the curator would end everything. The curator shouted that the League of Enterprises never leaves dogs that decide to snap unpunished. The curator threatened that Baek Woo-hyun's family and friends and everyone associated with him would answer for his mistakes. The curator thought that his words would help and save his life, frightening the young man, but he did not stop. Baek Woo-hyun didn't hesitate and immediately struck the experiment's curator, killing him. Blood spurted out and the curator let out his last groan. Kim Yeonjun covered himself with his hand from the splashes of blood and grimaced in disgust, looking away. Kim Yeonjun was unhappy with the fact that he was covered in blood and started cursing at Baek Woo-hyun because they still had questions for the curator, and noticing that his comrade was staring at one point asked him with even greater displeasure what he was doing. Baek Woo-hyun received a notification that the error correction task had been completed and he could return to the real world, and he thought that he could finally leave now. Baek Woo-hyun only had to press one confirmation button. In his mind, the young man was already home. As the mood grew, Baek Woo-hyun began to hear some voices that were outraged that he was going to leave them and forget them. The voices demanded that Baek Woo-hyun kill the others and avenge them to the end. Baek Woo-hyun was indignant. He admitted he was very tired and wondered if what he had already done wasn't enough. Baek Woo-hyun felt someone else's blood trickle down his hands, forming a small puddle. He was tired of the countless deaths and thought this might be his only chance. Baek Woo-hyun only came to his senses when someone grabbed him by the shoulder and called out to him. Baek Woo-hyun looked at his comrade and said that he wanted to return to his home world, but he only became indignant at these words and again began to convince his friend that he had been in this place from the very beginning. Baek Woo-hyun asked if his friend would tell the others about this and, smiling, pressed the confirmation button to return to the world and mentally apologized to the others. As soon as the young man pressed the button, he was instantly transported to the real world and woke up in his bed. The young man immediately jumped up on the bed and began to look around, trying to make sure that he was really in his room. The first thing the young man did was take his phone to check how much time had passed in the real world and how long he had been absent. Glancing at his phone screen, the young man discovered it was the very day he'd been drawn into the game. He was very surprised that time had stopped here while he was in another world. The young man approached the mirror and examined himself. He noticed that all the scars and muscles he had in that world had disappeared. The guy had the feeling that everything that happened to him was just a vivid dream. The young man recalled all the fights he'd been in and the strength he'd felt in his arms. He remembered how many people had died at his hands. Memories of his comrades who begged him to save them and talked about how much they didn't want to die came before his eyes. The most vivid image that emerged was that of the experiment's supervisor who threatened that Baek Woo-hyun would pay for what he had done with the lives and health of his loved ones. Returning to his room, the young man thought that it simply could not be a dream because the memories and sensations were too vivid, and he thought that the last 10 years spent on the other side were real. Just after returning to the room, Baek Woo-hyun heard the sound of the phone ringing and approaching saw Jong Naeon's name on the screen. Staring at the screen of his phone, Baek Woo-hyun stopped to think that this name seemed very familiar to him. Baek Woo-hyun picked up the phone and immediately heard the loud screams of Jong Naeon, who began to scold him for not contacting her, and was almost offended that their meeting had been forgotten. Baek Woo-hyun asked again about the meeting, and the girl emphasized that they were going to meet in the evening and promised to send the location and asked to hurry. When the girl hung up, Baek Woo-hyun suddenly realized something. The voice of the man he'd just spoken to on the phone sounded very familiar. Baek Woo-hyun remembered that young Naeon was once his very close friend. Moreover, it was Jong Naeon who introduced Baek Woo-hyun to the game in which he disappeared for 10 years. Baek Woo-hyun wondered if the girl could have known and planned everything, but before jumping to conclusions he decided to meet her first. Soon Baek Woo-hyun went to one of the city's establishments where Jong Naeon was waiting for him. When Woo-hyun entered the restaurant, the girl immediately noticed him and called out to him, beckoning him over. Jong Naeon had already taken one of the tables and was waving at Woo-hyun, openly happy to see him. Baek Woo-hyun went to the girl hoping that she was not to blame for his disappearance. Jong Naeon, noting that they were probably meeting for the first time after graduating from school, offered to have a drink, but Woo-hyun refused the offer. Woo-hyun thought that if he drank in such a state, he would have absolutely no way of predicting what he could do. Jong Naeon was surprised since when her friend refused to drink, but she suggested that he at least just order something to eat then. When the food arrived, the girl asked Woo-hyun if he had played Reverse Planet, reminding her that he had said he had tried to complete the training. Woo-hyun told his friend that he'd created a character and watched the intro, thinking to himself that he'd been sucked into the game immediately afterward. Jong Naeon was a little surprised by this response. The girl shared that she had the feeling that Woo-hyun hadn't played at all, but such nitpicking made him very angry. He understood that the girl didn't know that he spent 10 whole years in hell because of her, but he didn't know how to tell her about it, but he was still seething with anger. Jong Naeon sadly shared that she was really looking forward to her friend playing the game and reminded him that he promised to always be on her streams. She asked if he was a Coliseum ranker, noting that even displaying half that physical strength on her small stream would have caused a huge sensation. Baek Woo-hyun didn't really understand what they were talking about, but he quickly remembered that the girl had once mentioned streaming, and now it became clear to him why she had begged him to play with her. At the same time, Woo-hyun doubted that he had actually promised her, but the girl insisted that he had promised to show up at least once. After returning home from the meeting, Baek Woo-hyun immediately sat down at his computer. Woo-hyun began researching information about the game, even revealing that the developer's headquarters were in Silicon Valley. Leaning back in his chair, Woo-hyun let out a heavy sigh and asked himself to stop, because going to the developer's headquarters wouldn't solve his problem anyway. Even if he said that he ended up in another world because of their game, they would think he was crazy. Woo-hyun also thought that even if the developers were involved in such a nightmare, this expedition would be even more dangerous because it was unclear what would happen if they stirred up a hornet's nest. Woo-hyun leaned slightly in his chair and thought about what he was doing, because he should just be glad to get out of that hell and he shouldn't check anything else about this game. Woo-hyun thought that he should just forget about this game and think about the fact that he returned to his home world home. Woo-hyun tried to spend the following days with his old acquaintances, but he felt no joy at all. The young man tried not to show that anything was wrong and continued to communicate with his friends who had no idea what had happened to him. Baek Woo-hyun was just trying to live a normal life like an ordinary person and not stand out from the crowd. He went to classes at the university, talked with his friends, walked around the city, but obsessive thoughts did not leave his head. He began to be haunted by thoughts that he couldn't be completely sure he had entered the true reality or whether it was even his. He felt someone's hands on him, the hands of some spirits. It happened that these visions were so realistic that he would shudder and jump in place, starting to look around. While looking around, Woo-hyun never noticed anything strange, although she felt that something was starting to go wrong. He again heard voices from his past reality asking him to avenge them again. At some point, these voices became unbearable. Right in the middle of the lesson, Woo-hyun jumped up from his chair and ran out of the room. His classmates were very surprised by this behavior from a guy who had previously seemed quite normal. But no one could explain what was happening to him. Woo-hyun stood in the hallway leaning against the wall. He tried with all his might to control his thoughts and stop hearing those intrusive voices in his head. His vision intensified, and it seemed to him that some spirit was touching his back again. At some point the introduction and reality intertwined, and Woo-hyun, defending himself, grabbed the hand of some guy who only wanted to help him. Woo-hyun pulled the boy toward him and was ready to strike him, defending himself in every way possible. He felt as if he had a sharp knife in his hand that could save his life. But fortunately there was no knife, and Woo-hyun simply slightly grazed his acquaintance with his fist. The young man was very surprised and, rubbing his hand, asked Woo-hyun what he had done. Woo-hyun apologized and explained that his comrade had simply scared him a lot. As the young man walked away, he noted that many people were saying that Woo-hyun had been acting very strange lately. After this incident, Woo-hyun never returned to the classroom, but instead went out into the courtyard and bought himself a can of drink. Woo-hyun asked on a bench not far from the machine and bowed his head, thinking. Even then the visions didn't leave him. Souls from another reality reached out to him and whispered loudly. The souls begged the young man to return and fight for them, forcing him to avenge them. Suddenly all the visions stopped, and Woo-hyun saw his friend in front of him, who smiled at him and noted that he looked as if he had seen a ghost. Sitting down next to her, Jong Na-eon noticed that her friend had been feeling a bit tired lately and asked if anything was wrong. Woo-hyun, without even looking up, said curtly that he was fine. Jong Na-eon replied that if this was really the case then she would leave him alone, but asked that if it did happen then he could tell his older sister about it and she would help. After these words the girl left. Woo-hyun looked after her and suddenly realized that he himself had brought ghosts into this world. Woo-hyun stood near the game capsule and suddenly realized that the ghosts might not calm down until he fulfilled all their wishes. After thinking for a bit, Woo-hyun was convinced that this was the right move and walked towards the capsule. Without further hesitation, Woo-hyun carefully climbed into the capsule, thinking that if everything remained like this then this side of life would be no different from the other. Woo-hyun lay down in the capsule and closed the lid, deciding to go back. The only reason he saw for returning was to finally put an end to all of this. Woo-hyun appeared in a half-empty room where there was only a bed and a mirror with a greeting in the game from the system. Woo-hyun immediately recognized the place. He found himself in the lobby of a research lab. Woo-hyun wondered how he'd even managed to log into the game and how he couldn't get into the lab in that world. Woo-hyun didn't return to the world where he'd disappeared for 10 years. But that didn't make things any easier, and the young man wondered if there was some other reason for his stay in this hell. The system offered him the opportunity to choose his character's appearance, and Woo-hyun decided to simply go through the tutorial for now, assuming that he would be able to return home once he finished. Woo-hyun thought he should familiarize himself with the settings and started with combat adjustments, although he had fought well without them before. Reverse Planet was set up so that after choosing a primary ability, you could enhance your character with elements. Customizing your primary abilities and elements was called a build. The professional league had a huge number of elements, and there were professional builders who meticulously studied the builds. This is why Woo-hyun was able to achieve the metahuman title. Having selected the ability, Woo-hyun saw a speaker from which a voice was heard addressing the test subject number 48. The voice explained that the subject had awakened during the last test, and that a week had passed since they had last seen each other. Woo-hyun wondered if the game would show him the process that happens before the event and imagined what it might be like. Woo-hyun believed that no one would want to experience this even in a game. The voice from the speaker suggested that Woo-hyun proceed immediately to the next test and invited him to enter the room where the doors opened. The young man slowly entered the spacious hall well lit by white lamps. Woo-hyun saw a robot in the middle of the hall and immediately recognized it as an Eternal, most likely the first version. At that moment Woo-hyun heard again the ghostly voice inside his head calling his name, and before his eyes appeared the image of a memory of a girl screaming and asking to be saved. There were a lot of corpses of guys and girls in the hall who were test subjects. Woo-hyun remembered the old appearance of Eternal and remembered how all these memories are connected. The robot, seeing Woo-hyun, became active and ran towards him at a fairly good speed. Woo-hyun felt confident. While the robot ran, he stretched his arms and prepared for a fight. The young man thought that no matter where they were, the researchers always committed inhumane acts. As soon as the robot reached the young man, it immediately launched its first blow, but Woohin managed to jump aside. The robot's infrared eye kept a close eye on its target, preventing it from escaping. The robot's arms struck very sharply, which made it even more dangerous, and they could also lengthen, making it more difficult to dodge the blow. Woohin already had experience fighting such opponents and knew what to expect, so she dealt with it quite well. Woohin spent more than 10 years in this world and immediately became completely immersed in the former atmosphere of that hell. Moreover, Woohin immediately noticed that in front of him was only the first version of this robot, and although it was annoying with its capabilities, the fight with it was quite easy. Choosing the right moment, Woohin delivered a powerful blow to the robot's body. The killing machine was scattered across the hall in pieces. Woohin knew all the robot's vulnerabilities, so he had no trouble dispatching it quickly. The system notified that the newbie's test had been completed and called him Woohin amazing. A voice came from the speaker that the talent of the subject's abilities far exceeded the capabilities of an ordinary subject. The girl informed the young man that they should now proceed to the next test, and then some kind of grinding sound was heard in the microphone. The girl started to get indignant. Something was happening near her. The laboratory's alarm sounded. Suddenly the voice on the speaker changed and a different girl addressed the oppressed victims who were locked in the laboratory. The girl asked the prisoners to do everything possible to be released immediately. Woohin immediately heard the voice sound familiar. The system issued a new task requiring Woohin to leave the research center and go outside. Immediately the entire lab began to collapse. Woohin ran for the exit, thinking he should have gotten out first. He was running down the corridor when he suddenly realized the explosions had stopped. The young man assumed there must have been a lot of chaos in the hallways, but when he emerged he discovered the fight had already ended. He spotted a man near the shutter that apparently led to the exit. Looking at the man from afar, Woohin noticed the logo of the Dimension Management Bureau and realized that this man was not an enemy. The man assumed that Woohin was apparently one of the victims, and noting that if he had come all this way he probably wanted to escape, opened the shutter and said that he could help him. The man asked Woohin to choose whatever he wanted, and a selection of various weapons appeared before the young man hidden behind a blind. The man handed Woohin his radio and noted that he could use it when he was outside so that the bureau could find him. The man's hand suddenly went limp. Woohin realized with pity that the man was dead. Woohin didn't mourn the loss of the bureau member for long until he heard some sounds behind him. Another robot appeared behind him, literally emerging from the fire that had already engulfed the corridor. Woohin, thinking that he was just inside the game and only needed to take one step towards the development of the plot, hurried to choose his weapon. As soon as the young man made his choice, he again felt the presence of souls that demanded revenge, but for some reason Woohin felt disgust. Meanwhile, someone who appeared in the game said out loud that he was surprised that he was playing the country's favorite game. Kang Soyel, a professional gaming streamer, noted that her hipster pride was hurt by this fact. In the chat under the girl's stream, users began to complain about her speaking so negatively about the game, but the streamer noted that she didn't choose this punishment but promised to play, and since she never breaks promises to her viewers, she does so. The chat started to complain again about the game's choice, but the girl quickly changed the subject and said that as punishment for not being able to complete the last game, she wanted to dominate this one. Kang Soyel quickly saved her character's appearance, and saying that she was going to choose a cool ability also made her choice. The girl set the combat correction to 50%, but this only made her chat laugh, and he demanded to reduce the combat correction to 0. Kang Soyel wondered if it would have been possible to complete the training without any assists at all. The girl thought that according to her research, the overall percentage of users who refused the assist was 0. Kang Soyel trained using indie games and was confident in the physical exercise, but without correction it would still be like controlling a third arm that suddenly appeared. The chat continued to demand that the combat correction be reduced to 0, and suddenly the girls received a task to undergo training with 0 combat correction with a reward of 500,000 won. Seeing a good offer, the girl immediately shouted that real streamers always tried at least once, although in the chat they wrote that it was too much money for such a challenge, and began to laugh at how quickly the streamer changed her mind after seeing a tidy sum. Kang Soyel began her training by notifying that she would use 0 combat correction until she completed it. But the streamer quickly regretted following her chat's lead and agreeing to such a challenge. Just a couple of minutes later, Etnal killed her, and she had to fight him without even receiving an explanation, and he suddenly attacked her from an ambush. They wrote in the chat that holding out for 2 minutes wasn't that bad, although many professionals also failed because winning the Dynel without correction and with only one main ability was practically impossible. After looking around, the girl decided that since she had a radio and a weapon, it was still worth it to just run away Anya to get into a fight with the robot. In the next training task, the automatic selection of participants was launched, or rather a group of 4 people, and Kang Soyel suggested that she should discuss further actions with the members of her party. The system quickly issued a new notification that the selection of participants had failed, and the girl began to get indignant and say that there were too many players in this game since everyone loved this game. The automatic selection of participants was launched again, and at that moment Kang Soyel realized that she would be working with people who also had 0 correction. Finally, the group selection was completed, but the girl wanted to cancel all her tasks but was no longer able to do so and was joined to the task of escaping the research center. Kang Soyel realized that she had found herself in a very bad situation that she wanted to avoid at all costs. She was thrown into a room full of defeated robots, people from the bureau and members of the research lab. Kang Soyel and her chat were very surprised. I immediately thought that her partner was a real professional since he was able to complete the training without combat correction. It soon turned out that Kang Soyel's partner was able to defeat all enemies without weapons and not just without combat correction. Kang Soyel thought that she would be carried and become a secondary character on her own stream. The first thing the girl saw was a bloody knife with blood dripping onto the floor. Turning her gaze, she saw a tall, slender young man who was her partner with incredible talent. Woohan's gaze made the girl tense up, as it was, to put it mildly, not friendly. Kang Soyel timidly emerged from the corner. She was afraid that some of the robots or other enemies might still be alive and she would be quickly eliminated from the game. But to the streamer's continued fear, her partner immediately attacked her with that same knife. The knife blade stopped a few centimeters in front of Kang Soyel's eyes. The girl barely had time to scream and simply froze, staring at Woohan. Kang Soyel was around the corner in an instant and began to apologize, but Woohan apologized to her in return, noting that he had made a mistake in mistaking her for an enemy. Kang Soyel came out from around the corner and, noting that they were in the same stalemate, asked to go with him. The girl hurried after her partner and immediately introduced herself, said that she was hosting a stream, and asked if Woohan had any objections to her broadcasting their game. The girl suggested turning on privacy mode and covering Woohan's face. Woohan stopped abruptly. Kang Soyel wondered why he did it and if he was angry. Lab security suddenly appeared right in front of them. The 2 escaped test subjects were ordered to be killed. A burst of gunfire immediately followed, and it continued for a long time. Kang Soyel hid behind the remains of one of the robots and covered her head with her hands, wondering why the training was so difficult. Looking around, Kang Soyel noticed that her partner wasn't hiding at all. Woohan rushed at the laboratory guards, somehow miraculously dodging every bullet. Woohan looked absolutely incredible in motion. Kang Soyel couldn't take her eyes off him. Woohan quickly dealt with the gunman. Kang Soyel watched from the sidelines. The girl turned to her chat and noted that she wasn't very knowledgeable. When it came to the topic of the reverse planet, she assumed that what was happening was simply impossible. The girl asked the chat if anyone knew what ability her partner used. Someone suggested it might be wind, but no one was sure. One user wrote that the only main ability that changed the color of the eyes and increased physical abilities was the absolute being, which surprised Kang Soyel. The girl watching her partner was amazed because her entire chat was saying that those who chose the ability of an absolute being were scum. The absolute being was one of the key pillars of the game's countless possibilities. It significantly increases physical stats and skill resistance but prevents the use of abilities independently. Due to the penalty imposed on the user, this skill was considered completely useless. Kang Soyel was surprised and found it strange that she couldn't use her abilities in the game, as abilities were the ones that played the key role. The girl thought about how difficult it was to use abilities in battle without assists, and perhaps she should give up everything and go all in on physical stats. Kang Soyel thought that her partner should only be on the first level, but she still wondered how his movements were even possible. The girl couldn't understand who Woohan really was and how he acquired such skills that had astonished everyone. This guy wasn't just a player but a true killing machine. In a matter of minutes, Woohan dealt with everyone who stood in his way. After taking on several more deaths, Woohan heard the voices of the ghosts again. The ghosts insisted that it wasn't enough. The souls demanded that he be even more cruel in his revenge and said that they were not satisfied with his successes. Suddenly another one of the laboratory soldiers appeared from around the corner and immediately opened fire. The soldier aimed straight at Woohin's head, ignoring the girl. Kang Soyeol immediately jumped out of her hiding place as soon as she saw that her partner was in danger. Kang Soyeol wasn't hiding anymore. She jumped out and shielded her partner, deflecting the bullets. The girl then fired several shots in response, which scared the soldier, and he went around the corner again. Kang Soyeol didn't stop there. She leaped forward and, skidding across the floor around the corner, fired straight at the soldier, who hadn't expected such a blow. Kang Soyeol now understood that she had to put in a lot of effort to match her partner, with whom they were now competitors. The chat immediately praised how their favorite streamer acted. Kang Soyeol sat up and looked at Woo Hyun, seeing that he wasn't particularly pleased with her actions. The girl smiled and noted that it seemed like she had helped him, and asked if that was true. Instead of Kang Soyeol, Woo Hyun saw a completely different girl. Woo Hyun felt like he was in a completely different world and saw his former comrades and good friend. Woo Hyun literally froze in place until Kang Soyeol called out to him and made him come back from his thoughts. The girl asked the young man if he was angry with her, and he, although without a smile, assured her that he was not angry with her at all. Without even looking at the girl, Woo Hyun admitted that Kang Soyeol had truly helped him. Meanwhile, the chat members appreciated his response and expressed regret that they couldn't see his appearance due to his privacy settings. Kang Soyeol was glad that the young man was not angry with her and asked if she could continue her studies with him, promising to help in any way she could, and he agreed without any problems. Kang Soyeol followed her new friend. At one point, the girl addressed him as Mr. Almighty, but the young man revealed his real name and asked her to call him that. Kang Soyeol wondered if that was his real name and why, but then she did not undergo privacy settings, but later asked if he chose the absolute being as his first main ability, and he confirmed it. Kang Soyeol immediately asked how he could dodge bullets without abilities and what other games he played. Baek Woo Hyun replied that it was nothing special, but Kang Soyeol insisted on an answer. She didn't understand what was wrong, that he didn't want to tell her about it. Instead of answering her question, Woohin stopped and noted that there were two more eternals about 20 meters ahead of them. Kang Soyeol was amazed that Woo Hyun didn't have the ability to detect, but he could still determine how far away the enemies were and how many of them there were. When Kang Soyeol and Woohin turned down the corridor, the girl was convinced that her comrade was absolutely right about the number of enemies. Walking slowly towards the robots, Woohin said thoughtfully that he really enjoyed playing Coliseum back in the day. Woohin entered the fight like this, not facing two dangerous opponents. He does it with incredible ease. With just a few blows, Woohin dealt with one of the robots, slamming it into the wall. Then Woohin said that when he was really into games, he was a ranker there, and with these words he went to the floor for the second eternal. The second robot fell apart from Woohin's first blow. Kang Soyeol smiled and asked if being a ranker in the Coliseum was considered to be like being elite. They wrote in the chat that Butler, a professional gamer, was also a ranker. Kang Soyeol was amazed knowing that Butler was the biggest player in the professional scene of this game. Having finished with the robots, Woohin asked the girl to slow down and move further down the corridor. They would soon reach the final task. A red-haired man appeared before them, delighted to note that they had indeed reached it. This man was the lab's head of security and the training boss. The boss shouted that the potential players had no idea this place would become their grave. It was in this place behind the training quest boss that Woohin noticed numerous ghosts. These were likely the souls of his fallen comrades in another world. The ghosts asked Woohin to hurry and finally kill the service chief to avenge their deaths. Woohin simply froze in place, listening to every voice that whispered terrible things to him. The head of the service rushed at Woohin with a scream, wishing him a quick death. Kang Soyeol dropped to one knee and took out a firearm and began aiming it at the shift supervisor, while Woo Hyun simply stood nearby. The girl fired several bullets. The bullets, upon reaching the shift supervisor's body, slowed and melted into a barrier that appeared around him. Kang Soyeol nevertheless decided to find a shelter for herself and hid behind the wall, warning Woo Hyun that she would cover him from there. Woohin slowly moved towards the game boss, thinking that it was just a game, although he didn't believe it. He understood that the ghosts did not let him go in the real world, and he had to do everything possible to satisfy them at least a little. Kang Soyeol looked out from his hiding place and was immediately met with a powerful explosion and saw a large cloud of black dust appear in front of Woohyun. Kang Soyul froze in bewilderment when she saw what else her partner was capable of. The head of the service was still alive and had no intention of retreating and only cursed Woohin. The boss got angry and gathering his strength jumped on Woohin, threatening to tear him to pieces. Kang Soyul heard several blows in a row. Even the walls rang under the impact. The shift supervisor never managed to hit Woohin, who slyly dodged every one of his blows. The shift supervisor was getting increasingly angry at how long a small rat like Woohin could get away from him. Woohin gave the shift supervisor the opportunity to get his breath back and deliver blows. The laboratory's head of security continued to strike, advancing ever more harshly. In Kang Soyul's stream chat, many users wrote that even one blow from the service chief could be fatal, but Woo Hyun miraculously turned away from each one. Someone in the chat wrote that they couldn't dodge this boss's attacks even with an assist, and at that very moment Woo Hyun counterattacked. The boss flew back some distance and grunted. The ghosts whispered to Woohin not to put away his iron skill. Woohin stretched his hands, came closer to the boss, and said that he would not die so simply and easily. The head of security looked at Woohin and did not understand how the test subject could become so powerful. Woohin said quite coldly that he had become so powerful precisely because of himself. Kang Soyul stayed behind and watched the bloody mess that Woo Hyun caused. Soon the system displayed a notification that the task had been completed. Kang Soyul wondered out loud what she was even doing in this place. Still, the girl smiled sideways, watching her new comrade, noting that no matter what happened they had defeated the boss, and now all that was left was to get out of the laboratory. Kang Soyul called Woo Hyun and asked him to stop so that he could move on. And only this could bring him back to reality. The ghosts remained near the security chief's pipe, and Woohin no longer heard their voices. Soon Kang Soyul and Woo Hyun found themselves near the door that led outside. Kang Soyul asked if Woo Hyun was planning to continue with the main task that day. After looking closely at her partner, Woohin thought for a moment and replied that she no longer wanted to continue performing any tasks. Kang Soyul asked Woo Hyun to wait a minute, then ended her stream and thanked him for waiting, and he asked her a counter-question about what she wanted from him. Kang Soyul asked Woo Hyun to be a frequent guest on her streams. She really hoped Woo Hyun wouldn't refuse. Kang Soyul explained that they mainly participate in main quests and sometimes participate in PvP. The girl promised that she would try to ensure that the streams took place in accordance with his schedule, and in addition to this offered to provide a decent payment for participation. Woo Hyun looked down at the floor and apologized. Kang Soyul realized this meant refusal and also realized she couldn't convince him otherwise. Kang Soyul hoped for something but asked to add him as a friend, and Woo Hyun agreed. Before leaving the game, Kang Soyul thanked Woo Hyun and noted that it was fun to play with him and hoped that he would like the game. Kang Soyul left the game. Woo Hyun was left alone, realizing that the training was complete. The young man didn't understand why he hadn't returned to the other side yet. His anxiety was growing, but Baek Woo Hyun still didn't know much. Soon he was to learn about one person who would greatly influence his future life. Baek Woo Hyun had an interesting future ahead of her that he couldn't even imagine. Early one morning at the Korean branch of game developer Planet Earth, the entire office was thrown into chaos because of one player. This was an unprecedented incident in the company's history. All employees were extremely concerned about what was happening. Baek Woo Hyun's game was repeated over and over again. All the employees were shocked that a young man with no enhancements, no adjustments to his characteristics, and no weapons dealt with the head of security with his bare hands. One employee noted that the online community had already assumed that this player was using cheats, and users tweeted at management demanding an explanation. The entire company was absolutely certain that there were no cheats. The staff checked everything, even the logs from the moment the character was created, but no signs of hacking or the introduction of external programs were found. Over the years, the game's developers have seen countless hackers. Some even dared to walk through walls. One of the game hackers used invisibility in duels. The developers have seen a lot, but they have never seen anyone move the way Baek Woo Hyun did. Many of the developers were convinced that this was impossible even with the help of cheats. This guy was probably just a psychopath, if not a cheater. One of the developers emphasized that there was, however, a very small chance that this could be a new hack that they had not discovered, and the others agreed with him. The whole company was thinking that a very thorough check was required and the future of their product depended on it. A few days later, Woo Hyun met his close friend Jong Naeon at a local cafe. Woo Hyun learned from a close friend that his game had turned the internet community upside down. No one confirmed this, She was delighted by the news and noted that there was complete chaos and people even started their own challenges. The girl said that people insisted that Woo-hyun used cheats and admitted that she herself was shocked when she first saw the video. Woo-hyun was surprised that Noyeon even recognized him considering he was wearing a mask, and the girl reminded him that he'd given his name and that she'd also seen him fight before. The girl praised him profusely, and Woo-hyun said that now he understood why they contacted him. Noyeon was silent for a moment and then timidly asked who he was talking about. Noyeon jumped in her seat when she heard that the Korean branch of the developers had contacted Woo-hyun to find out if he had used a hack. Woo-hyun, drinking his drink, told me that he received a message from the streamer he was playing with. Noyeon noted that since the gaming company had openly decided to check him for cheating, it would attract a lot of attention, and asked Woo-hyun if he agreed to this check. Woo-hyun thought that this was the Korean branch, but nevertheless this was the only chance to directly communicate with the developers. If someone high-ranking appeared, he might get a hint about another world. Noyeon Woo-hyun said that he told the developers that he would think about their proposal and admitted that he was generally ready, which the girl highly approved of. Noyeon emphasized that if Woo-hyun wanted to continue being mentioned, he should have denied the accusations, but Woo-hyun responded that he didn't really care and doubted that people would even recognize him since he didn't show his face on streams. Noyeon explained to him that even with his different appearance, his fighting style was too unique and even the pros couldn't fight without abilities like his. The girl emphasized that on such days, even when professionals hid their identities, their fighting habits gave them away immediately. Noyeon moved back in her chair and said that it was still good that Woo-hyun decided to do this because otherwise that streamer would have burned to the ground. Woo-hyun was surprised and asked why this would happen since the girl had nothing to do with him, to which Noyeon replied that the mafia didn't care about this before, since as soon as the drama began they targeted anyone who was even remotely connected to what they needed. According to Noyeon, mafia could soon target us and that streamer girl just to get to Woo-hyun, which surprised him greatly. Woo-hyun looked at the glass with his drink and thought about Kang So-yeol. Kang So-yeol, upon receiving Baek Woo-hyun's message agreeing to the test, was shocked but happy. The girl understood that with this level of excitement her channel's viewer count would skyrocket. For her development and career this was great news, and all that was left was to wait a little longer. Kang So-yeol warned her viewers that they would soon witness something they had never seen before in the game's history, and announced that a cheat check stream was expected soon. For days later, the next game stream began. Woo-hyun arrived at the broadcast completely calm and collected. Kang So-yeol soon appeared and immediately ran up to him asking if it was hard for him, and began to apologize, considering herself to be at fault. Woo-hyun asked the girl not to worry, assuring her that he was fine, but asked if she herself didn't suspect him of anything, to which the girl replied that she saw with her own eyes what he did that day. Kang So-yeol thought to herself that what was even more important was that Woo-hyun's eyes looked like the eyes of a crazy killer, and she thought that a cheater couldn't look like that. Kang So-yeol suggested to Woo-hyun that they start the stream and continue the game, to which he agreed. Kang So-yeol greeted her subscribers and all the viewers began chatting, expressing their joy that the show was finally starting. Kang So-yeol was amazed that there were already 10,000 viewers at the very beginning of the live broadcast, which only proved how much interest this issue generated. Baek Woo-hyun introduced himself after Kang So-yeol, and immediately after that accusations poured into the chat that he was indeed a cheater and was not even embarrassed to appear in front of them. Kang So-yeol warned her viewers that if they wrote nasty things she would ban them from using the chat altogether. She then asked Woo-hyun what he thought about the whole situation. She wanted to hear his answer before they began the main investigation. Woo-hyun responded that they simply found it ridiculous that something like this would cause controversy, and this caused another wave of outrage from viewers. Kang So-yeol smiled and said that it was too amazing to just call it something like that, and after reading the viewers' questions about how the player was going to prove that he was not a cheater, she said that they invited a special guest to check. A man in trousers and a shirt appeared behind them holding a notebook in his hands. The man greeted him and introduced himself as Park Ju-myun, the manager of Task Force 1 at Planet Earth, Korea. Woo-hyun looked at this young man and thought that the task force manager most likely knew something, and thought that after checking it was worth asking him a couple of questions. Kang So-yeol and Woo-hyun thanked the manager for taking the time to come and see them. The manager looked at Woo-hyun and the first thing he thought was that this young man looked quite good. The manager smiled and explained that he would take Woo-hyun to the inspection area. They soon found themselves in a separate training room that players used to practice their skills or fight. The manager said that, as mentioned earlier, they would conduct several combat tests to check whether there was any help from the program. The manager examined Woo-hyun and asked if he agreed to be tested. Woo-hyun looked around and thought he'd never seen anything like this in another world before. He responded that he did. He smiled at the manager and announced the start of testing. His gaze was directed toward the doors at the other end of the room. The doors soon opened and a robot appeared from behind them, who was Woo-hyun's opponent. In the chat, they immediately learned that this robot was a mid-level Etnal and was a very strong opponent. The moment the robot appeared in front of Woo-hyun, the young man's eyes immediately sparkled. At that moment, he heard the voices again. The ghosts said they were afraid and again asked him to avenge them. The manager looked at his notebook and began to explain to Woo-hyun that from now on he had to kill this robot, but before he could finish speaking, the manager discovered that the young man had already rushed to the attack. The manager was amazed at such quick action on the part of the subject. It all seemed to happen in a second. The young man who had been standing next to the manager seemed to have vanished. The next moment, the manager had to use his notebook to shield himself from the floor debris and robot parts. The manager still made attempts to finish his proposal, but soon gave up, realizing that he simply needed to protect his face. The chat was simply stunned by what was happening. It seemed impossible that a player could fight such an opponent barehanded. At that moment, the system notified that no cheats had been detected. It was now confirmed that Woo-hyun had played completely fair. Everyone who saw this refutation could not believe that such skills in combat were really possible without the use of cheats. It was the loudest event in a long time of gaming streams. Woo-hyun easily dealt with a very worthy opponent which many players had difficulty dealing with even on their first try. Woo-hyun approached the manager and informed him that he had completed the task assigned to him. The manager was very puzzled by what he saw but noted that the young man had done well. The manager noted that they were unable to detect any external programs in the battle, but the problem was that the scan time was too short. The manager asked if Woo-hyun would be able to fight in the way that was explained to him, and he agreed with this. I understand that this was necessary in order to confirm that he does not use auto-combat. Chitata Boevka was essentially a proxy control system controlled by a program, so it could not perform combat actions exactly as the user wanted. Therefore, if a player decided in advance how he was going to win a fight and then fought in accordance with this plan, he could prove that he was not cheating. The manager asked Woo-hyun to cut off the heads of the middle training bots with his chain scythe this time. The manager grimaced slightly, and as he began his inspection thought that this wasn't at all advantageous for Woo-hyun. Training bots appeared in the gym and they had to deal with them in a specific manner. Watching the player, the manager thought that he could not imagine him losing. The manager's suspicions were correct. The next moment he saw the young man easily dispatch these enemies. The young man's movements were truly astonishing. No one had ever seen such moves before. Woo-hyun's speed was also particularly noteworthy. He didn't hesitate for a second and acted with precision. In one move, he could deal with several opponents, which gave him a great advantage in battle. His skills were very frightening and his sparkling eyes added to the fear. In the shortest possible time, Woo-hyun dealt with 3 new bots, cutting off their heads as the manager requested. Kong Soil jumped up and down with joy and asked the manager if the video was moving like Woo-hyun's chain was alive. The manager was very puzzled, but he understood that he had now collected enough data for verification. But as the administrator of this game, the manager was dying to know if Woo-hyun could defeat an advanced level training bot that only has one main ability. The manager knew she was being greedy, but she couldn't afford to give up on the idea. The manager released an advanced bot challenging Woo-hyun to handle it as well. This machine looked completely different from the others that had come before. The robot was in the form of a woman, quite human-like. It slowly emerged from the smoke and headed toward Woo-hyun. The chat room viewers decided the player probably wouldn't be able to handle such a difficult task, but the manager still announced that they would continue the test using the higher bot, which was a later version of Etnal. Woo-hyun saw his opponent and was a little confused. The sight of the Etnal evoked a variety of sensations. The robot strode straight toward Woo-hyun, who saw a completely different picture before him. He again remembered another world and how the same robot had strode over the corpses of his comrades. That time this robot smiled widely with a human smile and looked straight into the soul. The sight of his enemy sent a wave of hatred through Woo-hyun. He was ready to pounce and tear this soulless machine apart. Woohin immediately jumped up and rushed towards the Etnal. In the fight with this robot, Woohin received his first scratch during his entire testing and training period. Etnal was indeed very strong, but Woohin managed to hold out for a long time. At one point, Woohin missed a blow from the robot and slightly lost his balance, flying back a few meters. As expected, the intermediate bots were nothing compared to this. Woohin knew that allowing even one hit to land on him would be very bad. Moreover, the robot's body hardness was on a completely different level, and it was not so easy to break through. Woohin found that he was generally unable to harm the robot no matter how hard he tried. Woohin knew he had to come up with another way to deal with this enemy. Woohin couldn't think of anything better than to simply continue by Etnal until the damage worsens and it doesn't produce any results. The manager and Kang Soyul watched the battle in silence. They were speechless and couldn't even imagine who would emerge victorious. The manager thought that Woohin could actually match the advanced bot with just one primary ability. The manager noted that previously it seemed like he was being pushed back, but now the young man was starting to exert pressure on him. The manager decided to make it appear that further testing was pointless and ended the test, after which the robot immediately disappeared right in front of Woohin. The manager explained that he had deleted the training bot since enough data had been collected for testing. Kang Soyul asked the manager what the results of the check were, and he replied that it was clearly confirmed that no external program was involved at all and that Woohin was not a cheater. One user noted that the post accusing Woohin of cheating was immediately deleted. Kang Soyul smiled and noted that she had previously claimed that her partner wasn't a cheater, and there was no reason to doubt it. Kang Soyul addressed her viewers and emphasized that they should remember this stream and that Woohin never used cheats and simply had a mastery of mechanics on a cheat level. Kang Soyul also turned to Woohin and asked if he could tell the viewers what he felt, but Woohin tersely replied that they worked hard, which the manager confirmed, and with that the stream ended with 100,000 viewers. After the stream ended, Kang Soyul thanked her manager and Woohin for agreeing to participate in her stream, and the manager thanked her for her willingness to accept their request for verification. The manager wanted to leave, but then he heard Woohin's voice asking him to wait a little. Woohin indicated that he would like to ask a few questions, and the manager immediately became involved in their conversation and asked him to ask anything. Woohin looked closely at the manager and asked if there had been any bugs in this game before that were similar to something like someone getting stuck in this game for a very long time. The manager replied that he wasn't at all sure he'd heard anything like that, since if the game had such a critical bug, it wouldn't have been released. Woohin remarked that he'd heard and understood everything and was openly upset. The manager disappeared, leaving Kang Soyul and Woohin alone. The girl told him that she planned to share the income and broadcasts and asked if he would mind contacting her later, and Woohin responded by asking him to call him next time. Kang Soyul looked at him, thinking she couldn't just let him go since this man was her music video farmer. Woohin sensed this and asked if she had anything else to say. Kang Soyul thought about how she couldn't bring herself to invite him to her stream again, since the only reason he'd agreed was because he needed a chance to explain himself. Still hesitant, she said goodbye and left the game. Woohin reflected that he hadn't received as much information as he'd expected, and this was very disappointing. Immediately afterward, he received a message from Jong Naeon inviting him to meet in the battle preparation room. Noen's first question was whether Woohin had enjoyed the recent stream, noting that the community was on the rise. Woohin explained that it didn't suit him at all and that he had to pay attention to what the audience said when he played the game, and he just didn't like it. Noen responded by asking if he would be okay with just playing and not having to monitor the chat, which made the young man think. Noen promised to set everything up, and he just had to decide after trying it out. After giving her friend some time to think, Noen invited him to play PvP. Parapy was a game mode in which players competed against each other. It was one of the two most popular game modes in Reverse Planet along with PvE. Woohin wasn't particularly surprised when his friend activated PvP mode. Now he understood why she'd summoned him to the battle room so suddenly. Woohin admitted he simply felt it wasn't right for him, so he didn't plan on playing for a while. Noen grimaced and noted that PvP was the game's core content and he shouldn't have jumped to conclusions just by playing the tutorial. Woohin thought the PvE story mode was very similar to Another World, but everything he'd seen in PvP felt very new. However, he considered that there might be something other than just story mode and ultimately agreed. A duel was expected between Noen and Woohin. It was literally a fight between evenly matched opponents. There were two modes, solo and duo, and the first one to get 3 points would win. There were also several game modes. You could choose to play in a team of 5. Noan suggested playing a battle royale game where 100 people would be distributed across several zones searching for loot and fighting. It was a battle royale where the last person or team standing would win. Noan suggested teaming up as it was Woohyun's first time. She also noted that he needed a build for PvP and offered to recommend one if he wanted one, but Woohyun declined. Woohyun explained that he already knew a very good one. It was because of this build that he was called a Superman in another world. Woohyun suggested preparing his build while Noan was getting into the mode. Woohyun and Noan agreed to start with a popular military base spawn, a place where various high-level equipment was evenly distributed, and since high-level players flocked there, it was not suitable for beginners. Noan asked Woohyun to record their PvP game today because she wanted to post it on YouTube. Woohyun wasn't thrilled about it, but he agreed anyway, noticing that she seemed strangely agitated. Having exhaled and collected his thoughts, Woohyun asked the girl to get ready, also warning that he was entering the system. Noan smiled slightly at him and said that they would see each other on the playing field. Woohyun appeared in a dilapidated building along with another player. The player in front of him was twisting his head in all directions, trying to figure out whether he had appeared in the corridor on the 3rd floor. After he was convinced of this, he cursed, describing the place as crap. The player was about to move to another zone and didn't even notice that he had appeared next to one of the opponents. Meanwhile, Noan didn't have time to go very far before she was immediately confronted with a notification that her friend had already managed to kill someone. Then came a flood of notifications about more and more deaths committed by Woohyun, which was even creepy to watch. Jong Naeon didn't even know how to react to her friend's rapid reduction of their opponents. But she couldn't understand what he was even doing there. Meanwhile, Woohyun was crushing players one after another without even trying too hard. Woohyun was conscious of the fact that she couldn't sense the presence of other players at all. After dispatching another, he assumed it was the last survivor in the area. Despite this, Woohyun did not expect to encounter 4 people at once when he went down. Now that he was done farming loot, it was time to leave, and he took the most favorable path for him. At that moment, he heard the voice of his friend asking him to help her as she was surrounded by enemies. Woohyun immediately opened the map to see where Sun Noan was. He discovered that his girlfriend was a block away across the street, which was quite far away. Woohyun told her that he was already on his way and asked what part of the building she was in, to which Noan replied that it was on the roof of the 3rd floor. The girl also warned that there was such a loud noise coming from below that it seemed to her that someone was fighting on every floor. Woohyun quickly arrived on the scene and rushed to attack the players he just saw. The players couldn't figure out why Woohyun was so fast. One of them asked his comrade to prepare his abilities himself, promising to stop this psycho somehow. Woohyun meanwhile remembered that he had a knife and immediately pulled it out of its sheath. Woohyun threw a knife at one of his opponents. The dead player's comrade only managed to curse. He stared at Woohyun, not trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The player realized that Woohyun was using a build with agility and physical damage and immediately took damage. Fortunately for this player, the damage was not fatal and he was able to continue the fight. Woohyun ran up and did a somersault in the air, rushing to attack again. The player just froze in place and started swearing, "I just don't know what to do anymore." The next moment he had to leave the game. The system gave another notification about the murder of one of the players. Woohyun immediately ran to his friend's rescue. Soon several more murder alerts appeared. Approaching the building's gate, Woohyun contacted Noan and told her his location. She asked if she should go down for help. Woohyun asked his friend to just wait for him there and pulled the handle on the door. The door didn't give in right away and Woohyun had to pull the handle several times. Well before the doors opened, Woohyun felt that there were 5 opponents behind them. Woohyun opened the door and entered the room. Behind the open doors lurked the first of the players who had decided to set up an ambush. The player raised his hand in the mosque with a smile. "I think he will be able to defeat Woohyun this way." Before he could swing his sword, the player found his hand already held by Woohyun. The young man immediately felt strong resistance and realized that he had made a mistake. The next moment he had to exit the game and the system issued a notification about another murder. After throwing the player's body away, Woohyun thought about how he should have picked up the pace. Woohyun sped up to the 2nd floor as fast as he could, and in no time 4 more murder notices appeared. Jong Na-eon stood in her hiding place and only had time to watch the pop-up notifications, not understanding how Woo-hyun managed to do this at all. Noan smiled, noting to herself that Baek Woo-hyun now looked more like a smurf. Distracted for only a second, the girl immediately heard rustling sounds behind her and turned around sharply. The girl thought that it was one of the other players who managed to get close to her unnoticed. Woo-hyun was very surprised when Noan, who was trying to defend herself, struck him. Noan apologized, noting that she hadn't noticed him and confused him with another player. She immediately mentioned her 14 solo kills in the last few minutes of the game. Noan exhaled and smiling asked if he had already destroyed all the enemies in this building, but Woo-hyun was more interested in the weapon that Noan held in her hands. The girl explained that this was the only weapon she had managed to find and immediately suggested continuing the game while they still had time. Soon the game came to an end. Noan, shaking with exhaustion, noted that they had won 10 times in a row and that she couldn't play any more games and suggested they end it. The girl thought that in any case her friend, whom she considered an ordinary college student, turned out to be a crazy machine or murderer, and hoped that someday she would be able to invite him to the stream. Noan asked him to wait a few days without performing his main tasks so that she could make him a formal proposal, but he repeated that he was not interested. Noan continued to insist and asked her to listen, promising that she would come up with something interesting, and then left the game. Woo-hyun, as usual, was left last in the game alone with his thoughts. In the end, he too couldn't get any hints from PvP and left the game. Meanwhile, in one of the multi-story buildings in the residential areas, Kim Soil was relaxing in your apartment. The girl was lying on the bed and scrolling through the verbal feed of social networks. She went into the discussions and saw that a lot of threads were created about Woo-hyun and thought that this was the jackpot. Woo-hyun's last stream attracted 100,000 viewers. She wondered if something similar would happen again in her streaming career. Kang So-yeol really wanted to continue streaming with Woo-hyun and thought that maybe she should have tried a little harder to get his consent. The girl recalled how he turned her down, explaining that he simply didn't want to stream. She thought he wasn't being precise, but she was nonetheless convinced that it seemed he'd made his decision. Kang So-yeol decided she should start hunting for his share and open the app to see how much they had earned. The girl froze and immediately blushed when she saw the number. But she never expected such a result. The next day, Noan invited Woo-hyun to a cafe. Woo-hyun came, noting that he was very curious about why the girl had called him so suddenly. Noan took her laptop with her and opened it, showing a project of possible joint streams. Noan was very pleased and explained that she had created a presentation overnight to convince him to stream. Noan recalled their conversation about how he might consider and agree to host the stream if he didn't have to monitor the chat. Draw some conclusions. Noan suggested Woo-hyun to host a reality show. Reality television was a broadcast format in which several actors gathered in a studio and watched footage of other actors. Noan explained that Woo-hyun would play the game and she would maintain contact with the viewers. The girl also noted that if he suddenly decides that she alone is not enough, then they can involve professional casters. Noan also said with a smile that the profits would be divided 6-4, noting that this was very cool, but Woo-hyun, with a dissatisfied look, reminded that he was not interested in this at all. Noan emphasized that Woo-hyun apparently knew little about streaming profits and immediately remembered and asked if he'd made any profit from Soil's stream. After these words, Woo-hyun remembered receiving an email from the streamer that morning. Woo-hyun opened his mail and found a letter from Kang So-yeol, which was exactly about his share. Noan looked at her friend's phone screen and saw that the streamer had paid him 6 million won and asked if he was still sure that he wasn't interested. Woo-hyun noticed that the girl wrote that there were several donations in his name, and this surprised him very much. Some anonymous user donated him 1 million and talked about a special task for him and asked what it was like to return to reality, which alerted Woo-hyun. Woo-hyun became openly nervous and, getting up from the table, asked Noan if it was somehow possible to find out information about the donor. The girl asked why he needed this, since he would not be able to do this due to privacy laws. Noan explained that they wouldn't even be able to message them first and could only communicate during the broadcast. Woo-hyun dried her and decided to agree. Woo-hyun glanced at Noan and replied that he would start streaming with her. The girl was very happy about this and asked him just not to back out. Jong Na-eon immediately announced that streams of the Woo-hyun cheating game would begin soon. It was a beautiful Friday evening. It was a time when everyone could enjoy their leisure time and everyone had their own expectations. There were those who proudly called themselves nerds. These people gathered in front of their computers in united anticipation. These people have been waiting for the game broadcast from the cheater all week. 5 minutes before the game started, the hosts gathered in the broadcast studio. John Nguyen was incredibly nervous and shaking from her nerves. The co-host asked the girl not to worry, noting that they had prepared carefully and there shouldn't be any problems. Cha Sung-chul was a professional commentator. He shared with the girl that when he received the call and was asked to participate in today's broadcast, he too was very nervous. He admitted he never thought anyone other than Soyeol could summon 4 gammas on stream. These words slightly embarrassed John Nguyen, but she felt a little better. The girl thought Cha Sung-chul had promised to appear on the show as soon as he heard Woo Hyun's name and that she'd already talked about him a lot. After some thought, Nguyen suggested going live. The broadcast began. The hosts greeted the viewers. The chat immediately filled up with messages, and Nguyen noted that she could clearly see that many were confused because they hadn't seen the cheating game at the time and asked to be allowed to say that it was too early to be disappointed. The girl said that the cheater was already in the game. And at that moment, the viewer saw a broadcast from the game itself. The girl explained that the cheat tour in the show will also take the form of a reality show, and they will comment while watching Mr. Cheat Game's gameplay, which will in turn be hidden behind putty in privacy mode. Chan Nguyen, noting that she was sure everyone was eager to see this man's gameplay, suggested watching it together and announced the start of the game. Woo-hyun received a message from his friend about it. He launched the game and the radio in his hand vibrated. He received a notification from the Bureau of Management and the Otherworld. Woo-hyun found himself in the forest and was tasked with rescuing survivors so they could safely leave the forest and join the bureau. Woo-hyun looked at the task and realized that it was exactly the same as last time. But in that world, Woo-hyun was only focused on escaping, and this time he had to change his game tactics. Besides, Woo-hyun didn't have much of a choice but to just run away again and not help anyone. Woo-hyun took a deep breath or shouted loudly, calling everyone to him. The loud scream was naturally heard by the soldiers and lab workers who were hanging around nearby. The soldiers immediately got married and began trying to guess where they should go. The soldiers immediately began their movement and agreed that it was worth attacking the survivor from 3 sides. Only after reaching Woo-hyun did the soldiers or the laboratories do so. Several groups ran out from different forest paths. Woo-hyun activated his superpower. His eyes sparkled again, ready to kill everyone. Woo-hyun again felt the presence of ghosts that instilled even more hatred into his head. The laboratory soldiers opened fire with their machine guns. Woo-hyun didn't catch a single bullet, with his body dodging each one perfectly. No firearms could help the laboratory soldiers deal with Woo-hyun, who despite everything was too close to him. Soon several explosions were heard. The soldiers' weapons exploded right in their hands. Meanwhile, one of the well-known people was also spending time at his computer and getting acquainted with the latest news in the discussions. The man came across a discussion about Woo-hyun's performance with numerous outrages towards his character, as well as admiration to a greater extent. Among the discussions, a person found a message about how even a butler could resist cheating. This comment seemed funny to the person because he was that same butler. A few days later, Woo-hyun's second stream took place. Before the stream started, Woo-hyun was thinking about how anonymous viewer 62 hadn't shown up on the last stream and was trying to figure out what else he could do to make him known. Woo-hyun continued to complete the mission and brutally deal with the laboratory soldiers. Woo-hyun continued to be a killing machine that was unfazed by anything. Woo-hyun was always extremely attentive on the battlefield and noticed the smallest details. Chan Nguyen, watching his game, commented that it turned out to be not the game she knew about, which her commentator partner agreed with, noting that he had never seen such gameplay in his entire commentator career. Cha Sung-chul emphasized that Woo-hyun had no strategy and simply gathered all the enemies in his path, to which the comments wrote that apparently searching for enemies one by one took too much time and therefore he forced them to come to him. A user named My Beloved Cat donated 50,000 won, asking if the creature was too absolute and broken, noting that it didn't look like it had any cooldown at all. John Nguyen read the user's message and asked Cha Sung-chul what he thought about it, and he assured the user that this was not the case at all. Cha Sung-chul mentioned that most of the skills had their own unique recovery periods, and because of this it might seem like the cheater had too strong a physique, considering how he used his main ability without any cooldowns or anything. It followed that the absolute being only increased the user's physical capabilities. It did not affect his combat intelligence or weapon proficiency, and moreover the player did not use any amplifiers. Cha Sungchul emphasized that to be honest he thought that Wu Hyun could fight like that in real life if he had the same physical abilities, and in other words only he could reveal the true potential of an absolute being. Wu Hyun was completely focused on the game and the victory of all the laboratory soldiers. At some point the player found himself surrounded and a young man emerged from the forest. The young man introduced himself as Kim Cole from the Otherworld Management Bureau and asked Wu Hyun to drop his weapon and surrender. The Bureau of Otherworldly Management was a government department that dealt with invading entities that came through dimensional gates. Basically, it was the capture and destruction of dangerous creatures that were heading to the reverse world where the dimensions were mixed. Wu Hyun glanced at Kim Chul and recognized him. In fact, by this time he was already the team leader and he hadn't expected to meet him in this place. Director Kim assumed that Wu Hyun was a victim who escaped from the lab and apologized to him for mistaking him for an enemy. Director Kim noticed the radio that Wu Hyun was holding and he explained that an agent from the lab had given it to him. Kim Cole assumed that agent unfortunately was already dead and looked down at the floor barely holding back tears. Team leader Kim was still sentimental just as he had been in the other world. Director Kim asked Wu Hyun to remain at the Otherworld Management Bureau until they confirmed his identity, to which Wu Hyun agreed. The mission was completed and the level was raised. Wu Hyun found himself at the headquarters of the Bureau for the Management of the Otherworld. Wu Hyun was led into an office. Looking around he discovered it was the consulting office of the Otherworld Management Bureau. Wu Hyun never expected to find himself in this place. In another world he collected funds for his revenge by accepting requests from the company after escaping from the laboratory. He took on all possible contracts including assassinations and kidnappings. The biggest of them was the enslavement of the monsters of the reverse planet. The firm would task him with clearing out the reverse planet for battle spoils, and whenever they decided the loot was worthless they would shift the cleaning work onto him, and this naturally led to him clashing with the Bureau frequently. There were times when they collaborated on missions, but conflicts also arose frequently, and they ultimately ended up pointing their blades at each other. While recalling all this, Wu Hyun was distracted by the sound of heels right behind him. A young girl named Lee Yujin entered the office and explained that she was on the Bureau's first team. Wu Hyun greeted the girl, and there she approached his table, and sitting down noted that the young man had come a very long way. The girl explained that he had two options. The first option was to continue living as a normal person under the protection of the Bureau, in which case the use of his abilities was strictly prohibited. The second option was to become a member of the Bureau. The girl explained that if Wu Hyun chooses the latter option he will not be able to act as an official agent for a long time and only after certain training. As soon as they decide that he is ready to send him on a mission. Wu Hyun remembered that he killed one of their agents in that world, but now these people are asking him to become their ally. Lee Yujin leaned her elbows on the table and asked Wu Hyun once again which option he would prefer to choose. Wu Hyun looked at his hands, but before he could answer, stream stopped. Lee Yujin looked straight into Wu Hyun's eyes, waiting for an answer to the question asked. Wu Hyun stared at his hands and wondered which option to choose. Wu Hyun thought that if he decided to remain a civilian he would end up making corporate contacts like there, but he didn't want to go down that path again. He was also interested in learning about the Bureau's internal affairs. Wu Hyun decided to become one of the Bureau's agents, and Lee Yujin smiled, noting that it was the right decision and his joining them would be of great help. The girl said that recently corporations had been searching for awakened ones, so they didn't have enough people. Lee Yujin noted that she was not saying this because she was an agent of the Bureau, but she had to warn that there were rumors that many people lived there or that contracts were signed with them. Since not all of them were yet in the early stages of awakened training, they lacked the necessary experience and did not even take responsibility for accidents that occurred during training. Lee Yujin emphasized that unlike them, the Bureau was an organization with a long history and had extensive knowledge in training awakened beings and conquering and reverse world. Wu Hyun thought that in another world there were many awakened ones who died fulfilling the requests of the corporation. They even refused to pay on some requests, and in the end he had to use force to force them to pay the money. Because of this incident, Baru discovered that he was an unregistered awakened, and as a result the Bureau pursued him for some time, and it seems that is when he met Director Kim. Lee Yujin handed Wu Hyun the phone explaining that it was for work use and offering to register with their IT team. Woohin asked where he should start, and the girl explained that he should undergo training and get promoted as soon as they confirmed his abilities, and then a decision would be made about his team. The girl noted that she really hoped that Woohin would be sent to Team 1, in which she was a member, and getting up from the table, Woohin replied that he also hoped for this because he was with her for a long time while he was in that world, although she did not know about it. Woohin remembered how much she had done for him, even though they soon began to quarrel. But was it thanks to Eugene, who led the raid on the laboratory, that he and his comrade were able to survive? Lee Yujin and Woo Hyun shook hands and mutually hoped that they would be able to work together soon. Jong Noen, who was watching the gameplay, was very surprised at how Woohyun managed to talk so casually with NPCs because she thought it was impossible for game characters to communicate with her like that. Jong Noen recalled her personal experience interacting with this character, but her impression was completely different. The girl simply repeated the same words like a typical game character. Cha Sung-chul was also shocked and noted that Lee Eugene looked like a fully adapted and NPCs that could fully respond to any situation or request, unlike existing ones, or NBC could communicate freely and without problems. Cha Sung-chul noted that this technology took up a lot of resources, and most believed that it was impossible to implement in an online game, to which no one asked if this could happen. So the developers completely solved the resource problem. Cha Sung-chul replied that it probably wasn't true, because if it were true, they wouldn't have made an Easter egg because of it, although it might have been necessary to fulfill certain conditions to unlock this function. The minimum requirement for this was most likely to start without combat correction, and this was the only difference between Woohin and other players. Noen noted that in any case this was something that excited the forum, with which Songkal agreed, noting that he personally would be awake in anticipation of what the developer would announce. Cha Sung-chul thought that since she was very interested in the storyline, he was sure that in this situation she would be very intrigued and could perhaps attract a big figure to the show as a guest. Cha Noen asked viewers to wait for the next stream if they were interested in learning more, and informed them that from now on they would be switching to beer-based content. Soon Woohyun appeared in the battle preparation room waiting for his girlfriend. He was thinking about the fact that anonymous viewer 62 still hadn't shown up. Woohin couldn't figure out what he had to do to make this man remind him of himself again. Woohin asked Noen to immediately let him know if she saw any donations or comments with that nickname, no matter what situation he was in, but she still didn't say anything. Woohin let his friend know that he was ready, and the girl announced the next stage of PvP. Jong Noen also announced that the replay would be in a duel format and warned viewers that it was Woo Hyun's first time playing in this mode. There were 8 ranks in the game: Bronze, Silver, Gold, Platinum, Diamond, Master, and Grandmaster, with Challenger being the final rank. To reach Bronze, you had to win 10 times in the regular league. Cha Sung-chul said that according to statistics, it took a professional player about 30 minutes to do this, while the average player needed about 2 hours. Immediately, one of the users offered a mission for a donation of $500,000, where the goal was to win 10 games in a row in less than 30 minutes, and Woohyun immediately agreed to it. Cha Noen commented that it was getting incredibly exciting, and her co-host agreed, suggesting they watch the broadcast to the end to see if they could cheat regame and complete the mission. It was then that Jong Noen and Cha Sung-chul realized something very important after seeing how Woo Hyun handled himself alone on the battlefield in duel mode. Cha Sung-chul couldn't take his eyes off the screen, and even forgot that he was working as a commentator. Woo Hyun used a weapon that Cha Sung-chul had never seen before. Woo Hyun used 2 identical balls suitable for hand-to-hand combat. Woo Hyun's opponent knew that if they didn't get within his reach, victory would be his. But in reality, at that moment, everyone realized how much they had underestimated Woohyun. The player who became the opponent in the duel with Woohyun did not even have time to move in the first seconds of the fight. Woohyun cut his opponent into 4 pieces in a second, leaving him no chance to fight. Woohyun made sharp movements with his swords crisscrossing and simply jumping forward. The round had barely begun before it ended with Woo Hyun emerging victorious. The next round began immediately. A new opponent appeared opposite Woohyun, but upon seeing him and calling him a smurf, he decided to surrender immediately. Each subsequent game ended with a victory for Woohyun in the shortest possible time. The opponents who opposed Woohyun were completely amazed at how skillfully the young man bypassed all of their skills. None of the participants in the duel could last even a minute of the round. In the duel, Woohyun faced completely different players, even those who used only hand-to-hand combat. Each player found themselves cut into several pieces and thrown out of the game. Each of the opponents died the same death as the previous one, and Woohyun confidently moved towards victory in the mission. Thus, the amount of time it took Baek Woohyun to win 10 times in a row was only 20 minutes. Nguyen and Songkyul were as amazed as everyone else when they discovered how quickly Woohyun had completed the task. In just 20 minutes, Baek Woohyun managed to rise from a complete rookie to bronze. Cha Sung-chul noted that while the overall time he spent on it was undeniable, what was even more surprising was his match record. Usually people ran into trouble when they had to deal with counters or risky builds, but Woohyun didn't care what his opponents brought to the fight. During his matches, Woohyun always showed his personal game. A user named Shisheka donated 500,000 won, commenting that he couldn't believe Woohyun actually did it. The hosts thanked him for the donation and began to talk about how they were looking forward to Woohyun's performance in the upcoming ranked games. Cha Sung-chul shared that he is very worried about how long they broadcast and how easy it will be for people to snipe Woohyun's stream. Cha Sung-chul tried to clear his doubts and said with a smile that achieving success in stream sniping was not easy, so no one should worry about it. Another opponent appeared in front of Woohyun, but with unexpected words about how something had worked for him. The opponent smiled, noted that he finally met this shameless idiot, and asked the chat to be sure to follow the stream because he was going to destroy this cheater. Woohyun didn't react at all, and simply reached for his sword. The commentators laughed, apparently not bothering the cheater at all. Jong Nguyen explained that she warned Woohyun and asked him to just ignore something like that on the stream, which is why he was so calm. The first round of this seemingly promising battle has begun. Stream Sniper rushed into the attack, seemingly using all of his skills at once. The player was more than just confident in the sky and believed that he would easily be able to defeat Woohyun. Woohyun thought that he wanted to give this guy a chance because he was so confident in himself, but he turned out to be just pathetic. Woohyun didn't hesitate for even a second and immediately pierced the overly confident opponent with one of his swords. Before disappearing from the game, the opponent whispered that Woohyun was just a fucking monster. The next round began immediately. The player appeared again in front of Woohyun, no longer looking so confident, but instead thinking he should run away. The player knew full well that at this rate he would lose and thought that he would still have to use something to improve his chances and avoid further shame. When the second round began, it was as if lightning began to strike around the player. His confidence returned. Woohyun noticed that his opponent's atmosphere seemed to have changed. Woohyun was just waiting for the enemy to attack him, watching with interest what they had prepared for him. Woohyun noted that his opponent's attack had become much sharper and more powerful than before, and his movements were extremely effective like those of Etnal. The enemy shouted with a smile and asked if Woohyun now understood what was happening. The guy said that he simply went easy on Woohyun in the first round. The last player to think that Woohyun was an ordinary cheater who actually wasn't anything special. Nguyen, watching the battle, noted that she remembered that she told Woohyun to completely destroy the person who would call him a cheater. The player had no chance against Woohyun, who hadn't yet shown everything he was capable of. Woohyun was as always prepared for the upcoming fight and was fully focused. The player immediately noticed that his opponent had become very strange, but he tried to push all these thoughts aside. The game was beating himself that he had no reason to be afraid, and it didn't matter how he looked at it, convincing himself that he had the advantage. The player shouted, demanding that Woohyun finally stop showing off, and rushed into the attack. Woohyun rushed back at the player and, swinging his sword, ran a few meters behind him. The player felt a sharp, intense pain as well as the taste of his own blood in his mouth. The player realized that he was injured and began to curse at Woohyun even more loudly. At the same time, the player continued to stand on his feet and hoped that he still had at least some chance. The player prepared for another attack and tried to gather all his strength. The enemy leveled up and was ready to pounce on Woohyun. All spectators noticed that suddenly tears appeared in the player's eyes, and he clenched his teeth tightly. The commentators immediately responded with the same thought. They decided that Woohyun was most likely deliberately not finishing his opponent. Cha Sung-chul noted with a smile that it looked like Woohyun was carefully following Naeon's advice. Naeon was slightly embarrassed, noting that she had indeed asked Woohyun to completely destroy his opponent. Woohyun completely exhausted his opponent and ended up sitting on the ground near one of the graves without the ability to defend himself. The player began to demand that Woohyun explain who he was through curses, but then he gave the player the opportunity to look at his reflection in the blade of the sword and asked to let him do the same to his words. The second round ended with a score of 20 in favor of Baek Woo-hyun. After this, Baek Woo-hyun continued his matches at an unstoppable pace and won 30 matches in a row. Jong Noyeon noted with a puzzled expression that Woo-hyun had already managed to reach the gold rank, and Cha Song-chul admitted with a smile that he never thought that this player would have a win streak of 30 wins on his first stream. Jong Noyeon saw users' comments asking Woo-hyun to share his build. She knew most people wouldn't want that, but she had to at least ask Woo-hyun about it. Noyeon asked Woo-hyun if she could share his build, and to her great surprise he agreed without any problem. Noyeon notified everyone that Woo-hyun had just agreed to talk about his build and she would publish it. That's where the stream ended. The commentators said goodbye to their viewers and promised to see them again at the next broadcast. As soon as the broadcast ended in Chapter 6, I started shouting that it was incredibly cool, starting with the fully adaptive artificial intelligence and 30 victories and ending with the fact that Woo-hyun even decided to reveal his build. Jong Noyeon wondered if their friend was going to break the record with such speed and asked what the overall record for the number of wins in a win streak was at the moment, and Song-kal answered that the record was 76 and belonged to a butler. Jong Noyeon said that she really hopes that Woo-hyun will be able to break this record. Cha Sung-chul said that since Butler was famous for his competitiveness, it was quite possible that he was already watching cheating games. And Cha Song-cheol was absolutely right. Butler had indeed been observing the newcomer and his achievements. Butler hasn't posted any new threads on Baek Woo-hyun. The Butler found out that the player who wanted to defeat the cheater turned out to be a cheater himself. Butler soon came across a comment about how he couldn't win, and the streamers found this comment funny. A few days later, another broadcast took place. Woo-hyun kept thinking about the fact that his anonymous viewer 62 never showed up for the stream. Lee Yoo-jin called Woo-hyun over to her, waving her hand and smiling. People in the chat started writing about how good her adaptive intelligence was and how beautiful the girl was overall. Lee Yoo-jin noted that this was Woo-hyun's first practical assignment and asked if he was nervous. He replied that he was completely fine. As soon as Woo-hyun logged into the game, he received a new task: change into combat gear and report to a designated location. He was glad he could skip the training stages since it was a game, and immediately asked what the point was. Lee Yoo-jin explained that his mission was to destroy the invading creatures and seal off the space. She noted that they had ended up in another location abandoned by the Enterprise League where almost nothing is spoken but where they could sometimes be useful. The girl noted that as soon as they realize that they will achieve a lot, they just throw it away like that, and Woo-hyun Lee Yoo-jin mentally agreed with her that the corporations here were not that different from that world. Woo-hyun reflected that in any case the invading insect-like entities weren't particularly difficult. These creatures were weak, though dealing with them was unpleasant because there were so many of them. Lee Yoo-jin and Woo-hyun were met by several soldiers. One of them introduced himself as Sergeant Park Ji-hoon and asked if Woo-hyun was the one awakened from the bureau. Lee Yoo-jin showed her ID and noted that she really appreciated the sergeant's work. Then, looking at the ID, he allowed the two of them to go further. The heavy metal door slowly slid open and allowed passage. Woo-hyun saw for the first time when a portal appeared in an abandoned factory and was amazed. Woo-hyun was curious why this place seemed familiar to him. He had already seen this place in another world. Well, I clearly remember that it was of medium size and not so small. Woo-hyun wondered if it could be Bach or something like that. And at that moment Lee Yoo-jin suggested that he enter the portal and not hesitate. But before they could take a step, they encountered another man who appeared behind them and called out to Lee Yoo-jin. This man's name was Choi Hyun-chul, and he was an awakened member of Jumshin Electronics. Choi Hyun-chul asked why he brought the elder Lee Yoo-jin to this place for a minor suppression, and the girl asked in response what he was doing in this place himself. Choi Hyun-chul replied that he was just as shocked as the girl, not expecting his mission to intersect with hers. Lee Yoo-jin asked if he had been here before the mission. The girl suspected the young man was up to something. Hyun-chul turned her attention to Woo-hyun and, leaning slightly over him, asked the girl if she had brought a newcomer with her. Hyun-chul approached Woo-hyun and advised him not to waste his time in the bureau and join a big corporation. Lee Yoo-jin's voice became very sharp and she asked Mr. Choi not to cross the line. Choi Hyun-chul playfully raised his hands up and surrendered, noting that he would allow them to sort out the upcoming task and would not interfere with it. The young man immediately turned around and hurried away, wishing them good luck. Woo-hyun turned to the girl and asked who they had just met, and she said that this guy was the first agent trainee with whom she had to work. Lee Yoo-jin shared that ever since he left Peru after the Enterprise League, tracked him down. He had been spreading false rumors about the bureau. Cha Sung-chul noted that this was the first frame where the relationship between Lee Eugene and the main character was shown in such detail, and No Yun noted that thanks to the fully adaptive and they were able to see a deeper story. Lee Eugene decided that they should stop chatting and suggested that Woo-yun finally go on their mission. They had no idea someone was watching them. As soon as they entered the portal, a group of people immediately became aware of it. All the members of this group looked at each other and decided that it was time to start. 20 minutes later, inside the reverse world, Woo-hun was wandering around the area. There was blood visible on Woo-hun's cheek. He just recovered from a fight, so he couldn't guarantee he wouldn't be in any more skirmishes. But even though everything was out of order, he was focused. Walking a little further, Woo-hun came across a girl sitting near a stone with torn tights and pools of blood around her. Already a little bloody, Woo-hun immediately noticed a small candy in a wrapper which seemed to have been left on purpose. A little earlier than these events, Woo-yun and Lee Eugene emerged from the portal in the opposite direction. Lee Eugene explained that this is how Woo-yun will get to the reverse planet and this portal leads to it. Woo-hun told the girl that he understood everything, thinking that everything was exactly the same as in the other world. What lay ahead wasn't exactly an adventure. No one could have predicted that something like this could happen. Woo-hun looked around and thought that this could be a phenomenon. Lee Eugene turned to Woo-hinu and called out to him. She wanted to warn him of danger. The girl shouted, asking Woo-hun to be careful, and she disappeared in a bright flash of light. Instantly, everything returned to normal. The forest was silent again. Woo-yun wondered if he could have appeared separately from Lee Eugene. Reaching for his knife, Woo-hun thought that the path was often divided by an external force. Woo-hun should have dealt with the insects first and only then set out to look for the girl. Woo-hun knew what to expect from these creatures and as usual was not worried. It didn't take long to deal with the horde of different spiders. Woo-hun used Thunder Echo and killed several spiders at once. Under the blade of Woo-hun's knife, the limbs of the spiders and praying mantis monsters flew in all directions. Meanwhile, Lee Eugene was also fighting the insects, which were becoming more and more numerous. The girl thought about the size of the forest and settled on the thought that it was more like a medium-sized reverse planet than a small one. Lee Eugene felt that something was definitely wrong. The girl hoped that everything was okay with Woo-hyun, but she was too carried away by these thoughts and did not notice how Choi Hyun-chul appeared behind her. Too late, Lee Eugene heard the noise and turned back. Hyun-chul managed to wound Lee Eugene in the side while smiling broadly. Choi Hyun-chul quickly jumped away from the girl, fearing a counterattack. Lee Eugene looked at Choi Hyun-chul's smiling face and asked why he did this, to which he replied that it could be called a secret mission. The young man replied that he was simply following orders and that there was nothing personal about it. At the same time, another of his men emerged from the bushes and headed toward the girl. Lee Eugene didn't believe a word he said and called it all nonsense. But she was more worried that she had been wounded too deeply. Lee Eugene knew she had to get away from this place quickly. The girl got to her feet and tried to attack one of the guys. The girl then used a skill that summoned stone guards and thus encased the enemy in rocks. In a short time, these stones began to glow with fire and explode. One of the corporation's people was finished off, but the greater danger was Choi Hyun-chul himself. Henschel ordered his men to catch up with the girl, and he himself rushed after her. Lee Eugene gathered her strength and ran into the forest as fast as she could, trying to ignore the pain from her wound. At the same time, the girl tried to use another skill, but it was now given to her with great difficulty. After several attempts, Lee Eugene succeeded in using the fire weapon. Lee Eugene gripped the handle tightly and just hoped that she would be able to cope with the chase. At an opportune moment, the girl attacked the soldier running behind her. The fireball landed right at the feet of the soldiers. The soldiers argued among themselves about how no one could block the attacks of the girl, who managed to escape from them. Soon Lee Eugene managed to break away from the soldiers a little. She heard them arguing even more loudly about losing sight of her and blaming each other. The soldiers decided to split up to make their search for Lee Eugene more effective. They combed every bush along the way. Lee Eugene found a small hole that was hidden from view by various branches and leaves and climbed into it. Lee Eugene was very glad that she managed to find this place. I understand that everything could have ended very badly if she had not found a place to hide. Meanwhile, Woo-hun continued to fight the insects whose numbers were still not decreasing. Woo-hun was simultaneously trying to find the girl, and when he reached one place, he felt that she was definitely here. Woo-hun immediately felt that something probably happened to her. There was complete silence in the forest, but suddenly he heard a cry, and immediately recognized Eugene's voice. Woohin immediately jumped up and ran towards the sound. Woohin ran as fast as he could, making his way through the bushes and trees. Lee Eugene was grabbed by a huge centipede and spun between its paws. Woohin quickly found Lee Eugene and immediately rushed to her aid, attacking the huge centipede. In a matter of seconds, Woohin cut the vile insect into several pieces and freed Lee Eugene. Woohin didn't let the girl fall to the ground and managed to catch her in his arms. Baek Woohyun carefully carried the girl to a large rock and lowered her to the ground, first asking if everything was okay with her except for the deep scratches from the centipede. Upon examining her, Woohyun noted that her wounds were very deep. He completely doubted that such an experienced girl as Lee Eugene would lose to some beetle. Woohin quickly realized that these wounds were caused by a skill attack and began to think about who could have done this. Woohyun also quickly guessed and asked Lee Eugene if Choi Hyunchul had done this to her, and she confirmed it. It immediately became clear that Choi Hyunchul and his people appeared immediately after that phenomenon and most likely in connection with it. Jong Noyan immediately realized that something was wrong with the game, as Choi Hyunchul usually waited to set up an ambush. Noyan asked Cha Sungchul if he thought it was because of the AI, and he replied that the only conclusion they could come to at the moment was a possible hidden plot, which was becoming quite an interesting twist. Lee Eugene said that she managed to escape her pursuers, but they could return at any moment, and besides, if she used her skills, it could reveal their location to these people. Lee Eugene noted that in that case Woohyun would have to get out of this place first, but Woohyun responded by asking the girl to simply hide somewhere and promised to take care of these people himself. Lee Eugene shouted as loudly as she could, trying to stop Woohyun, explaining that Choi Hyunchul was an awakened veteran and couldn't handle him alone, but Woohyun promised that he would be fine. Woohyun walked along the path and warned that he had his own plan. Meanwhile, Choi Hongkal's men stood near the river, still trying to find Lee Eugene. Choi Henshal was sure that they would find her since the girl was wounded and could not have gone far, and asked his people to search further along the stream. Choi Hyunchul was about to go down, but he heard some rustling sounds coming from the forest. The next moment, Woohyun burst out of the forest, blazing in flames. One of Henchal's men didn't have time to react. He took the full brunt of the blow. Henchhold looked closely and recognized the intern Lee Eugene and asked if he was right. Woohyun raised his hands up and pretended that everything was fine, replied that he and Lee Eugene were suddenly separated from each other, and asked if anyone had seen her and knew what happened. In the stream chat, viewers began laughing at Woohyun being an Oscar-winning actor. Choi Hyunchul smiled, realizing Woohyun didn't yet know what had happened. Hyunchul smiled and looked Woohyun straight in the eyes and said that he could meet the girl if he got some sleep. But Hyunchul didn't have time to do anything before he received a sharp knife in his heart. Hyunchul was confident he'd be able to outsmart the new intern, which kept the confident smile on his face. The smile on Hyunchul's face didn't disappear even when he felt the cold blade of a knife pierce his chest. Soon it dawned on Henchul what had happened, and the smile disappeared from his face, and in its place was complete bewilderment at what was happening. Hyunchul's men also didn't immediately understand what had happened. They surrounded their home and looked at each other in confusion. Woohyun immediately disappeared into the nearby bushes, leaving the boys alone. One of the guys decided to stay with the boss and give him first aid while the other went after Woohyun. But as soon as the soldier stepped out from behind the bushes, he discovered that the trainee had already disappeared without a trace. The young man looked around, realizing that he could not run far in such a short time. Woohyun, choosing an opportune moment, jumped from the tree behind the fighter when he was peering somewhere into the thicket. The fighter didn't even have time to notice whose presence it was before his life was cut short. Meanwhile, his comrade was trying to save their boss. He asked Hyunchul to pull himself together, explaining that he had stopped the bleeding and that he simply needed to heal after they left. At that very moment, another knife flew from the same bushes into Hyunchul's chest. None of the boys expected such a thing to happen. The fighter cursed the trainee who was playing such bad jokes on them. Soon Woohyun himself emerged from the bushes. His eyes glowed a bright yellow. He was focused and completely calm. The surviving fighter asked where his comrade who had rushed in pursuit was, but Woohyun did not answer him. Woohyun tilted his head slightly to the side and raised his sword. The fighter immediately recognized the sword. It belonged to his comrade who had given chase. The soldier, realizing what had happened, became extremely angry. He'd lost two important people at once and was ready to tear the trainees to pieces. The fighter used the stone blade skill and many stone arrows flew towards Woohin. Woohin charged forward and was able to avoid every stone blade that flew towards him. The soldier didn't stop and shouted, "I'm still not done," refusing to give up. He then used another skill, causing an earthquake. The ground throughout the forest trembled, and in some places it even began to crack. But Woohin continued to approach the soldier, ignoring it. Woohin closely watched all of his opponent's movements, not letting him out of sight for a second. Woohin suddenly changed his trajectory and rushed towards one of the nearest trees and simply broke it with his foot. Woohin then ran to another tree and did the same to it as to the previous one. The last tree leaned over and rested against a nearby tree, creating what seemed to be an arch. Woohin did everything quickly, continuing to watch his opponent, who in the meantime was trying to take a more advantageous position. The soldier was shocked that a rookie trainee could do such a thing. "I thought he didn't have the strength at all." Woohin continued to remain in the arch of the trees and did not dare to stick his head out. Meanwhile, the fighter used a new skill and sent stone spikes towards Woohin, which quickly pierced one of the logs. It was thanks to the thick log that Woohin broke off that he managed to protect himself from the island of stone that could easily pierce him through. At that moment, Woohin received his first wound to the arm. One of the small thorns still left a wound. "I'll try not to pay attention to it." Woohin rushed to attack, although the fighter shouted in every possible way for him not to come close to him. As he moved, Woohin drew one of his swords. The last fighter suffered an irreparable blow. Woohin fatally wounded the boy with his sword. The soldier managed to realize what had happened, but did not want to believe it until his last breath. People in the broadcast chat immediately started writing about how incredible it was, and many people said they forgot how to breathe. Jong Noen was surprised that Woohin had just finished off 3 hunting dogs using just one key moment. Woohin thought that he was able to finish off 2 fighters, but as expected he was still lacking a lot compared to the time when he was in the other world. Woohyun looked around and headed towards Choi Henshal's body. Woohyun took out Hyunchul's phone and read the text message in which he said that Lee Yujin and the target would be sent to the opposite world. And it was worth trying to capture them alive. Well, if everything went badly, it was worth killing them. Woohin couldn't find anything other than this message and decided that this phone should be left for the Bureau's own investigation. Woohin managed to obtain items such as a sharp return dagger that slightly increased the cutting ability of the blade and returned back to the hand after being thrown. Woohin also managed to obtain the Victor's bracelet, which increased the power of the owner's ability and reduced the ability's recovery time. The Hermit's necklace made it possible to use the shadow storage. Woohin noted that it was possible to instantly check the effects of items, but in that world he could only assess what effect it would give through numerous trials and errors. Woohin decided that in any case, since the urgent matter had been settled, he had to hurry back to Lee Eugene. Woohin understood that now he needed to clear the reverse world before Lee Eugene's wounds became even worse. Meanwhile, Lu Yunjin was already standing on her feet as circumstances forced her to continue fighting. A huge creature appeared right in front of the girl. It was the captain of the Scorpion Emperor entities. Lee Yujin was complaining about how she and the intern were having such bad luck that day, but then she thought it could have been worse if this creature had appeared with the junior intern and not with her. Lee Yujin mentally prepared herself for battle. Her wounds still hurt, she was exhausted, but she had no other choice. The girl believed that she had to deal with this monster on her own. Lee Yujin accumulated enough energy and used the spread skill. The girl discovered that her ability did not help the matter in any way, and the creature did not react to it in any way. Taking a closer look, the girl realized that the Emperor Scorpion was simply falling to the ground. The girl spotted Woohyun on top of the scorpion. One of his swords was in the scorpion's body, the other was slung over his shoulder. The boy asked if Lee Yujin was okay. The girl didn't expect to see Woohyun in such a guise and in an instant defeating such a complex monster. Raising her head up, the girl discovered that cracks were appearing across the sky, which meant that the other world was beginning to close. Lee Yujin wanted to praise Woohyun when he came down to the ground to her, but he suggested that the girl first get out of this place and asked her to jump on his back. Chan Noen asked that since the capture was completed after the passage had already been destroyed, would there be a closure of the works before they were released. Woohyun grabbed Lee Yunjin tightly as she climbed onto his back and asked the girl to hold on tighter. They had very little time left to reach the portal and return back home. Immediately after that, Lee Yujin and Woo-yun headed back to the Dimension Management Bureau headquarters. Kim Cole, the head of the Bureau's Dimension Management Department, took the first opportunity to inquire whether it was true that Yujin had been injured due to an ambush set up by another awakened. Woo-hun confirmed his words once again, to which the director, barely holding back from cursing, said that the corporations had completely crossed the line, and then asked what had happened to them. Woo-hyun briefly replied that he simply killed them, which greatly surprised Kim Chul and made him ask if he did it himself and how he managed to do it. Woo-hun remembered the moment the bureau found him, and it seemed strange to him that the director was even asking such questions. Looking at the young man, Kim Cole suddenly remembered their first meeting, and his questions about his abilities disappeared. When the supervisor asked for evidence, Woo-hyun provided him with Choi Hyun-chul's phone number. She said there were signs that he had received instructions via text messages, but this could not be verified further because everything else was blocked by the security system. The head of the department replied that thanks to this the investigation would go smoothly, and asked Woo-hun to leave the rest to them and take a break, which he did not argue with. Before Woo-yun left, the office manager Kim asked him to wait a minute. The manager said that everything that was said was just out of concern and promised that they would have another chance later. The manager looked the young man in the eyes and emphasized that he needed to calm down until then, and asked if he understood what was being discussed. Woo-hun looked down at the floor and assured that he understood everything perfectly, and then headed for the exit. Jong Noyan noted that Woo-hyun's first mission was finally completed, and Cha Sung-chul emphasized that it was much more spectacular than they had expected. Sang Cheol hoped their viewers were also pleased, judging by their reactions. No-yun decided to read the chat and suddenly froze when she saw that the same anonymous viewer 62 had sent 3 million won with a caption stating that Woo-hyun had passed his first test and now needed to complete a special mission. None of the presenters even expected that this man would appear again and radically change their show. Noan was the one who was most looking forward to seeing this user, although I didn't understand why this particular person was so important to Woo-hun. Noan immediately reported the incident to Woo-hun, and it was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Woo-hun felt a slight sense of relief. Noan sent screenshots so that Woo-yun could see everything with his own eyes. Woo-hun studied everything and after thinking it over asked Noan to just continue streaming for now, to which the girl agreed. Cha Sung-chul realized that something was going on and whispered to his colleague what had happened, but the girl didn't show it and assured him that everything was fine. Noyan was surprised that Cha Sung-cheol was even asking about it, as if she hadn't noticed the donation window. So the girl decided not to think about it for now. We just get on with our work. Noan suggested moving on to PvP battles, but for some reason she even screamed, which scared her colleague. The girl said that the cheater was winning one after another, gaining popularity in the last PvP match, and Cha Song-kal asked what the topic for PvP was today. Noan announced with a smile that today's topic was PvP battles in various modes. These were 5v5 team games, and the first to achieve 2 victories would win. In the chat, everyone immediately started writing that it was very boring, but no one was expecting exactly this reaction. But the girl was convinced that all the spectators would change their minds as soon as they saw everything with their own eyes, and announced the beginning. A team was quickly assembled, which included Woo-hun. The attack team's task was to deliver the cargo to its destination, while the defense team's task was to stop it. The first round began immediately. The hum of an engine could be heard, and soon the truck was moving forward. There were 2 people standing on top of the truck guarding the cargo. 2 team members ran in front of the car, protecting it from possible ambush, while another drove the car. Woo-hun, why did you, on the contrary, start moving away from the car, leaving your team aside, which surprised the commentators and the viewers too. Woo-yun didn't really think about how he looked from the outside at that moment and what the team members would think of him. Commentators suggested that perhaps Woo-hun wanted to get behind his opponents, but it all boiled down to the fact that it was very difficult to stop 5 people alone. The chat started arguing about whether Woo-hun would be able to defeat 5 people, and everyone came to the conclusion that there were probably only newcomers there and he would cope with it. Woo-hun was moving at a very good speed, and the commentator said that at this rate he should soon run into the defense team. Woo-hun moved mainly along the top, and when the defense team withered, he attacked them from the air. Woo-hun reached for his sword while in mid-flight. The young man took a swing, aiming at one of the targets. Woo-hun also threw a small knife at one of the team members, and it pierced the guy's shoulder. Another member of the team raised the alarm. The next moment, this guy was defeated. Woo-hun landed right in the center of where the boys were standing. They didn't feel very confident and were acting rather confused. The guys thought they simply had a bad team and decided to split up. One would go for the cargo while the other would remain alone with Woohin, who was just waiting for it. Meanwhile, Woohin's team simply stood there and watched as notifications about the deaths of the opposing team's members popped up. Soon the system gave a notification that the first round was completed. Noan noted that of course she thought that Woohin would carry his entire team, but she never imagined that he would end up doing exactly that. Cha Sung-chul wondered if Woo-hyun was busy at the moment and what he even does at times like this. Thus continued 3 other modes, with Woohin emerging victorious and very quickly. It all began with deathmatches. It seemed that none of the possible modes presented any difficulty for the Woohin. After the fights to the death, Woohin participated in the King of Woe mode, where he also naturally won. The other players couldn't understand what was happening to their opponent and asked him to stop. But Woohin was unstoppable. He found every enemy, giving none the slightest chance. Now hell was being arranged by Woohin himself, who was so eager to escape from it. Woohin was a true killer who didn't think on the battlefield but only acted. Woohin also participated in the capture the flag mode. Baek Woo-hyun aced each of them and quickly ended the game. Thanks to this, he managed to get another anonymous viewer donation, 62, and his special mission. Jong Noan was crazy to see another 3 million donation and immediately reported it to Woo-hyun. The girl suggested that they could have spent the money on a meeting for subscribers as well as on dinner or new equipment. Woo-hyun interrupted her and asked her to simply send him the screenshots. Woo-hyun learned of his new quest, which required him to unlock a new system through in-game progression. This meant he too should continue playing, whether in PvE or PvP. Woo-hyun decided that for now she would do whatever this viewer wanted and not refuse anything. The third cheat tour was scheduled for a few days later. Woo-hyun went to the Dimension Management Bureau's training center. Woo-hyun received a message from Lee Yujin, who wrote that she would most likely not be able to teach him for some time due to her injury, and said that she had found a replacement. Everyone was incredibly curious about who this man sent by Lee Yujin was. Lee Yujin and Woo-hyun met in the training room. She looked well enough but still complained that due to her injuries she couldn't return to training yet. Lee Yujin looked somewhere to the side and exclaimed that her replacement had arrived. A girl entered the hall and walked slowly towards Lee Eugenia and Woo-hyun. The girl greeted everyone and introduced herself as Kim Han, immediately causing a frenzy in the chat. Baek Woo-hyun introduced himself in response and thought for a moment. Woo-hyun reflected that Han's skill was inferior to Kim Chul's. She was in fact the second most powerful person in the Dimensional Management Bureau. The situation became quite dangerous when he encountered her as an enemy in another world. Lee Yujin immediately noted that she should already go since she got out secretly, to which Hannah began to scold her because she told her that permission had been received. Lee Yujin realized that she had taken everything and immediately hurried to leave the training hall before I had to deal with Hannah, who was already very angry. Woo-hyun and Hannah were left alone. They spent only a short time in silence due to the awkward situation with Lee Yujin. Hannah turned to Woo-hyun first and asked if he used a long sword or a short sword, and then he answered her that he used both. Khan was given such an answer and a task that made her really want to test this guy's skill level. Hannah suggested that they start with a duel, and he wasn't particularly opposed to it. John Nguyen and Cha Sung-cheol were amazed by how the game was unfolding. It seemed like pairing was a common occurrence for such players, but Cha Sung-cheol claimed there was something more to it. Cha Sung-chul emphasized that not all players used a sword, but this was only because Woo-hyun was the main character. Cha Noen realized that this was indeed the case and was also horrified when the chat noted that most of the players were skill users. Cha Sung-chul said that he thought that AI would have limitations even if it was fully adaptive, but it turned out that this was a completely different plot twist compared to other users. This meant that the game had the ability to progress with a completely different story depending on the player's actions. This could easily be compared with reality. When everyone realized this, most people got goosebumps because it was simply unbelievable. No one could wrap their head around this kind of NPC behavior. This wasn't the first time the artificial intelligence had simply amazed them. The development of the game's events was also completely unpredictable, making the spectacle incredibly interesting. It seemed that the events were actually taking place in the real world. Mom wanted to verify that it was just an ordinary computer game. Hannah suggested to Woohyun that they not use their abilities and only use the sword in this sparring, but Woohyun replied that it would most likely be impossible. Woohyun explained that his ability was to improve the body, and it was always active including at that moment, to which Hannah replied that in that case she would simply try to slow down her abilities a little. Hannah walked away a little and looked at her student with a smile. Woohyun followed suit, but it was very hard to catch a smile on his face. The sparring began. Hannah attacked first. She desperately wanted to test this guy's capabilities. The teacher struck the first blow, but Woohyun managed to block it a little, although his balance was slightly lost. Hannah put a lot of effort into making the young man fall. Hannah leaned her whole body on Woohyun. Using the maximum of what she allowed herself, Hannah managed to push Woohyun, throwing him back a few meters. Cha Sung-chul noted with delight that Kim Ha-na was not someone to be underestimated and was in fact a very strong girl. The presenters even agreed that technically Khan had a build of the wind god. The fight wasn't all that quick. Woohyun finally faced a worthy opponent. Hannah never paused for a second during the entire fight. She closely monitored her students' movements and continued to attack. Woohyun quickly realized that the girl was not just fast but was also deliberately looking for a gap in his defense. There was a smile on Hannah's face. Each of her attacks was accompanied by a snow-white shining smile, and it seemed like she was about to laugh with delight. After some time, Hannah said that she now understands that this sparring can be taken a little more seriously. Woohyun understood perfectly well what she was talking about. He was extremely focused, having never fought such a good opponent before. Hannah didn't feel sorry for him at all, and it was scary to imagine what powers she had if she didn't restrain them. Having struck and missed, Hannah noted that she had anticipated this perfectly. She knew Woohyun could dodge this blow. In the chat they wrote that few could defeat Khan and were glad that Woohyun was finally fighting someone equal to him. Hannah told Woohyun mid-sparring that he was even more amazing than she thought. But Woohyun thought that if this were his real battle, his chances of winning would be about 20% since he was so far behind compared to when he was in the other world. Hannah asked Woohyun who he studied with in Fedhoveni, and he replied that he was self-taught. Hannah was surprised that he was self-taught but had reached such a level, and after thinking a little asked the guy to follow her, explaining that she wanted to show him something. Soon they came to a hall where various weapons hung on the walls. Sharp swords with different hilts could be found on the stands. On another wall one could find axes, both single-sided and double-sided. This place was the arsenal of the Bureau of Measurement Control. Kim Hyun-woo, head of the support and assistance group at the Minwo Measurement Management Bureau, noted that the Woohyun system seemed to need a suitable weapon. Hannah grimaced slightly and agreed with Kim Hyun-woo, explaining that the guy already had a weapon, but what was the point of it if there was no way to use the abilities? Kim Hyun-woo bowed his head as a sign of respect and asked Han and Woo-hyun to consider their choice in comfort before leaving them. Hannah turned to Woohyun and noted that he could take his time with his choice and consider everything carefully. Woohyun began to walk around the hall, but still could not find anything truly useful for himself. Having settled on the vampire spear, the Dragos, Woohyun decided it might at least be somewhat suitable. This spear increased the cutting power of the spear blade and also absorbed the blood on the blade, healing the wielder and granting control over the blood. Woohyun was about to say that he had made a choice, but suddenly something else caught his attention. The young man turned and looked behind him. As he walked in that direction, he hadn't noticed the weapon, which now caught his attention. Behind him stood a soul devourer. It was the sword of eternal death, the first effect of which could not be undone. This sword increased its cutting power depending on the number of souls it absorbed, healed its wielder, and several other effects were sealed, meaning they could not be unlocked. Woohyun picked up the sword and wondered why it was in such a place when it should have been on the black market. He also suggested that perhaps it had originally belonged to the Bureau and then been stolen. Woohyun never thought that he would find his favorite weapon in such a place. Woohyun showed the Soul Eater to Hannah. She clarified whether he was sure of his choice, and he confirmed it. The girl was surprised that he chose a two-handed sword, but a little later she said that she would ask him to transfer the ownership rights to this weapon to him. The hosts were shocked by what was happening. This was usually the moment a player would receive a weapon with 2 effects but not one with 5. Cha Sung-cheol noted that this was not the first time that Woohyun received a weapon that was inappropriate for this stage of the game, and noted that the Hermit's necklace that he received in the last stream only appeared in the mid-game. Cha Songcheol also said that the inverse planet gave rewards strictly depending on the risk, and the more difficult the task, the greater the reward, which in general everyone should have known. John No-yun asked if Woo Hyun might have gotten the necklace because he had to defeat hunting dogs on his first mission. Cha Sung-chul confirmed this, explaining that the protagonist had performed flawlessly from escaping the research facility to sparring with Kim Hana. Jong No-in thought that the Soul Eater in that case made sense as a reward that Woo-hyun received for all his successes. Soon ownership of the sword was transferred to Woo-hyun. He thanked his teacher for this and deposited the sword in the Shadow Vault. Hannah suggested they go on a raid together now that her student had a new weapon. Hannah led him to the mountainous terrain, requiring him to use the portal again. The girl, appearing on the opposite planet, exhaled heavily. Hannah said that she never thought that there could be a portal on the top of the mountain, and admitted that she was already very tired from the hike to it. Hannah was indignant that he promised that it would take only a short walk to the portal. Apparently, he deceived her. But still, they were soon at the place where invading creatures like the wolf beast appeared. Hannah explained that these creatures had a strong territorial instinct regarding their habitat, and they would soon begin to crowd together. Woo-hyun thought that they were of the beast type and were more difficult to deal with than insects, but everyone below rank B was the same, which eliminated the need to search for them. Hannah warned that she would intervene if the situation became too dangerous, but until then she would simply observe. Woo-hyun summoned a Soul Eater from the Shadow Vault and prepared for a fight. Soon the barking of dogs and the sound of stamping feet were heard. Woo-hyun felt that these dogs were quickly approaching. Woo-hyun was already prepared for the coming battle. His eyes lit up again. He was again confident that he would be able to easily defeat these dogs without much difficulty. Woo-hyun waited until the wolves were close enough to launch the first strike at full force. With one blow, Woo-hyun managed to kill 4 animals at once. A few more sword swings followed, and Woo-hyun finished off the remaining ones. The system notified that the Soul Eater's cutting ability had been increased. Chan No-in watched the gameplay with delight and noted that her friend swung such a huge sword as if it were a feather. Woo-hyun emphasized to himself that the way this weapon fit his hand was different from other types of weapons. Hannah watched her student's movements carefully and even opened her mouth slightly in surprise. Hannah was shocked to see her student perform a celestial moonstrike. Woo-hyun was very pleased with the weapon he had managed to obtain. While he didn't hear what his new teacher was so surprised about, the girl didn't even know how to react correctly to such skills. Very soon Woo-hyun was already standing calmly among the corpses of the wolves he had defeated in literally an instant. But now Woo-hyun had to deal with the elite squads of these wolves. The dogs rushed at him in unison. These creatures were now an order of magnitude stronger than the previous ones and much larger. Woo-hyun was completely unfazed and rushed to attack in response. Cha Sung-chul sank into the sofa, wondering in surprise where Woo-hyun had learned martial arts, not to mention that his first strike resembled that of the heavenly moon Kim Hana. Cha No-in said, confused, that as far as she knew her friend had never played sports, and then asked what if they were at the Colosseum. She wondered what kind of results he would have achieved there. At one point in the fight, Woo-hyun experienced some difficulty and almost fell into the jaws of one of the wolves. Woo-hyun managed to regroup and aim his weapon just in time to attack another wolf. Hannah, watching all this from the sidelines, smiled contentedly. She thought this guy was more than just gorgeous. The Soul Eater's ability improved more and more, which was nothing short of gratifying. With each death by this sword, the sword grew stronger. Woo-hyun exhaled a little and again heard some strange sounds from the thicket of the forest. Woo-hyun listened and took a defensive stance, although not everyone understood what was actually approaching. A huge wolf's mouth appeared from behind the trees, exactly 10 times larger than all the previous ones. An entity in the form of a silver wolf came to Woo-hyun. It was effectively the alpha wolf, and thanks to its speed and size, it was a true weapon of destruction. The creature crushed everything in its path. Wherever it ran, trees were torn up by their roots and the ground cracked beneath its feet. Woo-hyun blocked the blow, but the silver wolf pushed him back. This fight was very difficult even for Woo-hyun, and this beast posed a great danger. At some point it seemed that Woo-hyun would not be able to cope with this monster. The boy barely dodged one of the silver wolf's attacks. Miraculously, he managed to jump back. Woohin immediately noted for himself that this creature was definitely much stronger than just an elite leader. But after thinking for a bit, Woohin decided that it meant nothing to him. Woohin seemed to have gained new strength and rushed at the predator, dealing him several blows. The Soul Eater absorbed the leader's soul and improved its ability. Hannah said with a smile that this is what she expected from the Bureau's best agent. The girl admitted that she thought about intervening because the entity in the LC was incredibly strong and very difficult to seduce. The presenter began to talk about how this mission was incredibly difficult and was designated with a high difficulty rank, but nevertheless it turned out to be even more difficult in reality. But now it wasn't a matter of difficulty. For some reason, the location wouldn't close even though the leader's essence had already been destroyed, and this was a very unique phenomenon. Hannah emphasized that they should find out where the legs were in this situation and led Woohin along with her. Woohin and Khan walked through the forest and soon stopped where the reason why the location was not closing could possibly be found. In one of the clearings, we saw a large nest with an egg. Right before their eyes, the egg began to crack. The creature inside began to hatch. Hannah jumped back and asked Woohin to be careful because they could not even guess what kind of creature was in the egg. Well, to my surprise, a very cute and affectionate puppy crawled out of the egg. The puppy quickly freed itself from the shell and began running in circles around Woohin and Hannah. Hannah emphasized that this was definitely not the norm, since an otherworldly being that was benevolent towards people was something impossible. Woohin asked the teacher if they should kill the puppy, and the girl explained that this was standard protocol, but the situation was unusual and they could take it to the lab and have it examined. Woohin didn't argue and took the puppy by the scruff of the neck and carried him along. Now they had to get out of this place and hurry to the laboratory to examine the puppy they had found. Woohin and Hannah returned to the HQ Measurement Control Bureau as quickly as possible, and upon seeing the puppy said they had never encountered anything like it. The scientist noted that research showed that this creature was not an otherworldly life form. The man also noted that they could only assume that the summoned entity was created with the help of some ability, to which Kana replied in confusion that none of them had such abilities. The scientist replied that they could also assume that the call could have come from the reverse planet Anya from the two of them, and promised that they would continue the research more thoroughly. Hannah asked if the Bureau would protect the puppy, and the scientists explained that it looked like it already had an owner, and according to the rules they couldn't provide protection to someone else's living creature. The system issued a notification that Lightning Wolf had been registered as Woohin's pet. At this point, another announcement appeared about emergency server maintenance, and therefore it was worth interrupting the broadcast. Chan Noen was confused because her friend had just received a pet that didn't exist in the system, and suddenly they announced that an update was being downloaded. It seemed like the game might have been urgently updated because Baek Woo-hyun got a pet, although people in the chat laughed at this, saying that everyone had an overreaction. Well, it was only worth testing this in practice, and that's why the stream had to be interrupted. The stream ended soon after. The man approached the TV with the remote control to turn it off. In a conference room in the US on Planet Earth, HQ couldn't figure out what stream they were talking about. Baek Woo-hyun was believed to have discovered a fully adaptive artificial intelligence that even they themselves were unaware of. They had been keeping an eye on him for a long time, but now they could no longer remain uninvolved. A system update occurred that even the developers were unaware of. Sophia, the lead developer of Reverse Planet, couldn't find a reasonable explanation. One of the developers stood up from his chair and said that everyone knew that there was only one person who could do this, and his name was Isaac. Isaac was the former chief designer of the Reverse Planet, a renowned genius but currently considered missing in action. Sophia thought that this weirdo, as expected, had disappeared from the radar for a reason, and she still didn't think that he would close the server to arbitrarily update the game. Sophia asked the others what happened to the Deus, and they told her that they tried to wake him up, but there was no reaction yet. Deus was an artificial intelligence created by Isaac to help develop the game, but since then Zeke has disappeared and stopped functioning. Sophia stated that it was worth checking if there were any other update files that they didn't know about, because if something like this happened again, they would be in serious trouble. Another of the developers was indignant, emphasizing that they would hardly be able to find them, since if Isaac didn't want them to find them, then it would be impossible, but Sophia sharply retorted that they were obliged to do this at any cost. Sophia also added that they should have put Baek Woo-hyun on the priority list and continued monitoring the live broadcast so that they could immediately take action if something happened. Sophia tried to guess what Isaac could have planned, but she was absolutely sure that she would not let his plans come true. Soon, an anonymous viewer 62 donated 5 million won for Woo-hyun to complete the mission. This anonymous viewer explained that Woo-hyun would need a trusted companion for his next mission.